Welcome everyone to our penultimate day of the Fatimid Cosmopolitanism conference hosted here in London at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. For those of you who were not here on the previous days, my name is Gregory Bellato and it's my pleasure to welcome you here. Today we have Fatimid Decorative Arts and Archaeology Part 1, which will be hosted by Professor Stéphane Pradines, the al-Dahhān University in London, and he will be moderating the session. So now, Stéphane Pradines.
Thank you, Greg. So good afternoon or good morning, and it is my pleasure today to introduce Anna Contadini, Professor of the History of Islamic Art at the SOAS, University of London. She is one of our greatest specialists of Fatimid art, and she recently published the Pisa Griffin and the Maria Shah Lion, Metalwork in the Medieval Islamic Mediterranean. Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Stéphane, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Gregory, for organizing this important event. It's 23 years after the major one in Paris, around which we also organized an exhibition, the Institute du Monde Arabe, that then traveled to Vienna. This conference has given me the opportunity to concentrate on the casket of Ṣadaqa ibn Yūsuf, which I have been looking at for a long time. It has been treated in the literature, but has never received a focused, in-depth study. My research on it is in progress, and it's part of the work on objecthood, on translocation and transculturation, considering both the historical and cultural balance of such objects, and on visual imagery, which in this casket is conveyed by the extraordinary decorative motifs, as well as the extraordinary inscriptions. The casket was translocated in the treasury of the Real Colegiata de San Isidoro in León, Spain, where it is presently conserved. It is rectangular, quite small, and I should like to thank Raquel Gomez Jaén of the Real Colegiata for these wonderful photos. It has a slightly convex lid fastened by 3 large hinges attached with metal pins. It is of silver, gilded and decorated with yellow, forming a pattern of fine spirals joined one to the other by small stylized leaves and covering the whole surface. The object was conceptualized as a whole from the beginning, as the hinges are perfectly positioned between the words of the inscription and don't obscure any of them. There are 2 inscriptions, one running all along the rim of the lid, and another underneath the fastening of the front lock. The main one is very important. It's because of it that we know that the casket was made for Ṣadaqa ibn Yūsuf. It has been read by various scholars, if with some uncertainties. The inscription starts from the front of the casket, and my reading is as follows. Isti'mal li khizanat Ṣadaqa ibn Yūsuf, سعد كامل وإقبال شامل وإذ دائم وأمر عالي والدرجة رفيعة لصاحبه. And a translation is work commissioned for the treasury of Ṣadaqa ibn Yūsuf, perfect happiness and complete prosperity, and lasting glory and high position and exalted status to its owner. Who was Ṣadaqa ibn Yūsuf, or Abu Mansur Ṣadaqa ibn Yūsuf al-Falahi? We are lucky to have documentary evidence from al-Maqrizi in his It'az al-Hunafa that tells us that he was a vizier of the Fatimid Caliph al-Mustansir, who reigned between 1036 and 1094, when the Caliph was only 15 years old. Ṣadaqa's father, Abul Fadl Yūsuf ibn Ali, was one of the skilled scribes and chancery officials and was in charge of the Damascus Diwan. When the long-serving Vizier al-Jarjara'i fell ill, He wanted Ṣadaqa to be his successor and be made vizier, but with a supervisor, the older vizier Abu Sa'id al-Tustari, who was the favorite, it seems, of al-Mustansir's mother. His appointment together with Ṣadaqa may reflect a power struggle, but could also be interpreted as indicating that Ṣadaqa was rather young and insufficiently experienced. Ṣadaqa was invested on Wednesday, the 11th of Ramadan, 436 Hijri, which corresponds to 1044. He was a converted Jew, described as being outstanding in the various chancery skills. He began by taking over the administration of Sham, or Syria, but only stayed there for a very short time, soon moving to Cairo, where he continued his vizierate until 1047, when he was imprisoned and put to death. The casket was therefore produced for a Fatimid vizier, and we can also date it precisely to between 1044 and 1047, and it's not often that we can date a medieval object within the span of 3 years only. But I would suggest that it was probably made early on, possibly for the occasion of Ṣadaqa's investiture as vizier, which, as the sources reveal, was a grand event. The second inscription is also on the body, but on the area covered by the lock. And reading it was a surprise. It's usually thought to mention the name of the craftsman, Uthman, in the reading Amal Uthman Naqash, ? Which has been translated as Uthman engraved. However, this reading doesn't take into account grammatical features. For example, it ignores the definite article before Amal, and it also doesn't account for 2 letters at the end of the line. The new reading I'm proposing here for the first time takes into account epigraphical features, the full extent of the inscriptions, and also, importantly, questions of speciality. Al-Amal Mubarak Farid. The work is blessed and unique. What a wonderful line. Like the main inscription around the lid, this too is extraordinary, given the object the great agency of being blessed and unique. It fits perfectly within the space reserved for it, between 2 symmetrical decorative elements at the beginning and the end, and I would also argue is symbolically appropriate for the appointment of a new, possibly young vizier. It's possible that the previous reading, that with the supposed name of Uthman, was prompted by expectations of what an inscription position in that place should read. Indeed, it reminds us of one on another casket that ordered by the Umayyad Caliph of Spain, Al-Haytham II, for his son, Hisham II. In this case, the inscription under the lock is not on the body of the casket, but on the lock itself, and does mention names. It says that the work was done or supervised by Badr and Tarif, or Zarif, as Anna Lavarta has recently proposed. So although the position is similar, the content of the inscription is quite different from that on the Ṣadaqa casket. There are also differences in the epigraphical style of scripts, as well as materials, forms, and construction. Indeed, the epigraphical style in our casket is very different from what we find on Spanish material generally, not only of the earlier caliphal period, but also contemporary 11th century Taifa material, such as, for example, the casket of Santa Eulalia, studied in detail by Antonio Martinez Núñez, whom I'd like to thank for discussing this important point with me. To give just a few examples of Spanish silver material with yellowed inscriptions and decoration, we may mention 2 other objects of the 11th century for which Rafael Azuar has hypothesized a workshop in Toledo. A box datable to the first half of the 11th century, also once part of the treasury of San Isidoro, with an inscription which is augural and benedictory, and a perfume bottle in the Museo de Teruel, with an inscription that tells us that it was made for Zahr, the wife of the future Taifa king Abdul Malik ibn Khalaf, who ruled between 1044 to 1103, and is therefore datable to circa 1044 or even earlier, more precisely contemporary, therefore, with our casket. The epigraphic style of all these pieces is quite different from that observed in the Ṣadaqa casket. Indeed, the epigraphical style of the Ṣadaqa casket can be securely related to that of Fatimid inscriptions, which are often characterized by decorative projections and tendrils that come out from the upper parts of the letters, a type of the family of floriated Kufic that perhaps does not start with the Fatimids, but certainly developed and flourished under them. There are examples in monumental epigraphy, as in the mosques of Al-Azhar and Al-Hakim, and this style may have spread to other parts of the Mediterranean, also affecting the portable arts, part of Fatimid cosmopolitanism. As examples, we have other Fatimid metalwork, like the Benaki silver mirror, and examples from archaeological material, such as the metal objects from Tiberias. I could cite several examples, but I have selected this deep bowl, the benedictory inaugural inscription of which has very close epigraphical characteristics to those of the Ṣadaqa casket, in particular in the prolonged curly ends of a waw or ra or a final mim, and in the tendrils that emerge from the upper part of the letters. One characteristic of the Ṣadaqa casket that strikes me in particular is that the ends of the letters, especially those that curl, are often transformed into the same decorative elements that surround them. So for example, if you look at this dal and the upper part, it becomes part of the curls that surround it, and the same for the end of the mim here, and the same for the end of the ra here. This conceptualization of a figural or epigraphic element dissolving into another is typical, I would argue, of Fatimid art and can be found in other objects. In this famous wooden plaque carved in relief, we see that the head and neck of the horses, quite naturalistically rendered with their trappings, dissolve into the vegetal elements that surround them. Also significant is the spiral ornamentation at the top and the little curly vegetal element that you can see, for example, here, that surround them. Figural and epigraphical elements are intrinsically linked with the vegetal decoration, with one almost generating the other. The presence of the casket in Spain has been attributed to the dispersal and looting of the Fatimid treasury in Cairo in 1069. But it's possible that it moved for reasons other than looting. As I have long maintained, for example, in relation to Middle Eastern objects found in Italy, war and looting were by no means the only reasons for objects to travel. They could be translocated via diplomacy, trade, or for religious reasons. They may have been containers for relics, but also, and importantly, they could have been acquired for the preciousness of their materials and for the symbolism associated with that material, or for their aesthetic qualities, qualities that would actively participate in the performative role they would have in the new geographical and cultural context. The casket might hypothetically have left the Fatimid treasury before its dispersal, but we lack documentation. The casket has a wonderful niellot decoration. Niellot or inlaid decoration is an ancient technique, as is gilding. It consists of taking out thin portions of the silver to create grooves that then are filled with a black substance. In the Islamic period, we have a recipe as early as the 10th century from the Yemeni author Al-Hamdani. And we also have references to niello later from the Persian author Abul Qasim al-Kashani in 1301, studied by James Allen. That the casket was made for a Fatimid vizier doesn't necessarily mean that the casket was made in Egypt. And here the presence or absence of lead in the typical niello compound of silver and copper may be relevant as an indicator for provenance as well as dating. And I thank Beate Fricke for sharing her views with me on this point. Studies by Katia Viegas on Andalusian silver hinges of ivory objects in the V&A in collaboration with Mariam Ross-Rowan may suggest that the employment of lead began already in the Caliphal period in Spain, although the data may not be conclusive and not all the examples of niello analyzed contained lead. We would need a larger database from such analysis to reach a more conclusive verdict, and technical studies continuing with Therese Martin's project on the medieval Iberian treasury in context. What is certain is that the technique of niello on silver is well attested in various parts of the Mediterranean during the medieval period, including quite early in the Fatimid period, as we'll see. Silver objects are frequently mentioned in Fatimid sources, including with the specification of being decorated with niello. The Geniza documents talk of silver cups, beakers, incense burners, boxes, and of silver bracelets decorated with niello, which in the documents studied by Goitein are referred to as silver siwar mujra bisawad, literally silver bracelets treated with blackness. According to these sources, they were more prestigious than those decorated with filigree. Goitein reports documentation of the 12th century, but that silver objects were decorated with niello at a much earlier date is confirmed not only by the 10th century Al-Hamdani, mentioned earlier, but also and importantly by Al-Maqrizi, where reporting the looting of the Fatimid treasury in 1069 in his Kitab al-Malwaiz wal-Ittiba, he mentions that vast numbers of silver objects came out of the treasury, and importantly, in a passage that seems to have been overlooked, mentions big and small silver objects grooved with black, fidda mukhraka bil sawad. And he even adds an aesthetic comment saying that they were made with the greatest artistry. The textual sources are matched by the archaeological finds. We don't have a comparable example to the Ṣadaqa casket, which seems to be a unique piece. But apart from coins, we do have other types of Fatimid silver objects, including ones decorated with niello that have been found among Fatimid hoards, such as the one from Caesarea. They include amulets and a pair of crescent-shaped earrings. And I thank Ayala Lester for sharing these photos with me and for confirming that the niello of these items has not been tested, so we don't know its exact composition. The earrings are very beautiful, and you can see the niello decoration both on the decorative motifs and in the benedictory inscription. An important but very little known object that I'm researching is this Fatimid rock crystal bottle in Capua. I'm showing you the drawings because the images haven't arrived in time. The mount, including the lid that you can see on the right, is original to the rock crystal, datable to the late 10th century, and is in silver gilt decorated with niello. So this last example adds to the evidence from the archaeological finds and the written sources, confirming that silver objects decorated with niello were produced in Fatimid territories, at least from the 10th century. As for the decorative motifs on the Ṣadaqa casket, other than those around the inscriptions already discussed, we have this fantastic visual effect of the spirals, each measuring just a few millimeters in diameters. And the concept of a compact round decoration that doesn't leave spaces and is applied to the whole surface is found on other Fatimid metalwork, as on the hair you see here. But what about the spiral motifs? These are unusual, but the glass ewer cut in relief found at Fustat, possibly of the 10th century, is of interest, and not just for its connection with rock crystal ewers, and that's another lecture, but to stay with the Ṣadaqa casket because it provides an unexpected parallel in the compact, extraordinary semi-spiral decoration on the body. In conclusion, the evidence I have discussed today points strongly to connections with other Fatimid objects and helps situate it culturally. The casket thus makes a significant addition to the repertoire of Fatimid art, and silver in particular, a body of material that has not been studied enough. For the casket, much remains for me to investigate further, including its aesthetic language and appeal. I mentioned how its letters and the floral elements become integrated, one element dissolving into the other. But it's important to note that the area of spiral decoration is also a visually active element, encouraging the eye to travel in different directions and not allowing it to settle. And the viewer can become engaged in different responses to this ornament, from the initial sensory one to a deeper one that goes beyond the visual understanding and can touch the emotive sphere. It's a wonder, it's an ajab. In the ongoing debate of ornament in Islamic art, this extraordinary casket will make a substantial contribution. There is much more that I could say, but time's up, and I leave you with the blessings of this mesmerizing image. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, to be on time, right on time. And now we will move to the next presentation. No need to present, of course, Bernard O'Kane, Professor of Islamic Art and Architecture at the American University in Cairo. Bernard is one of our greatest specialists of Islamic architecture and mosque, from Iraq to Southeast Asia, and of course, one of the best specialists of Egyptian architecture. Bernard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stéphane. You should be looking at the apex of the dome of the Mosque of al-Jayushi in Cairo, which is a good summary of some of the elements I will be talking about, which are closely related to light. So, for instance, in Farhad Daftari's work on the Ismailis, he has pointed out how an Ismaili doctrine with regard to God and creation, God first created a light. And he also notes, of course, the recurring theme of Ismaili doctrine, the Nas, the divine light that was transmitted through successive Imams who were descended from Ali. Let me give you a few quotations from Qadi al-Nu'man's, the famous Fatimid jurist's work, Ikhtilaf Usul al-Madhahib, the disagreement of the jurists. He says that Muhammad is the messenger of God, a light for all lands, Nur al-Bilad, lamps, masabih, shining in the murk, leading out of the labyrinth of blindness and the gloom of perdition. He also says elsewhere, the truth is illuminated by a light. And he quotes the hadith, my companions are like the stars, no matter which of them you follow, you will be led aright. Now, this topic has been partially covered before by James Allen in an article on Fatimid symbols in Ayyubid and Mamluk art. And he mentions, for instance, the Shia author Rashid ad-Din ibn Shahras Shub on the virtues of the family of Abu Talib, where a poem by Imam Hussein is quoted in which he says, my father is a sun, my mother a moon, and I am the star. My grandfather was the lamp of guidance. Now, I could, of course, follow this with other quotations, but surely this is enough to show how the emphasis on light pervades Ismailism. This is a remarkable document here because it's the first example known to me of an epigraphic hexagram. In this case, it's in the name of Muhammad written 3 times and Ali written 3 times. And the hexagram, of course, has been associated with the seal of Solomon, from a very long time. It was a decorative motif in pre-Islamic art, but you can see it in many examples of, let me give a little pointer here, many examples in pre-Islamic art. This is in the facade of Qasr al-Hayr. This is on a possibly 9th century doorway, which is on display in the Louvre Museum of Art. In early Fatimid examples, we have the star in the minaret of the Mosque of Al-Haytham on the right-hand side. There's another plain 6-pointed star on the left-hand side. And we're going to look at a little detail here in the Bab al-Futuh dating from the late 11th century, where you have both the interlacing triangles of the 6-pointed star and the 5-pointed star, which also actually is associated with Solomon. Another example of an epigraphic type where the name of Muhammad is written in the form of a star repeated 6 times with Ali in the center is in the Mihrab of Sayyid al-Ruqayya, dating from 1133. And the other smaller adjacent mihrabs in the shrine also have 6-pointed stars in them. These are 2 different ones. And a similar feature is found in the late Fatimid mausoleum of Yahya al-Shabihi. We're going to look at a detail of the mihrab and the surrounding ambulatory here. It's not epigraphic, but it is in the form of the 2 interlaced triangles. And they're found in later monuments such as the Mosque of As-Salih Talaya in the very end of the Fatimid period, 1161. That's a detail from the sanctuary. And there are some examples that are also found in metalwork. I'd like to thank Dr. Bellotto for the use of these illustrations from his thesis. So a tripod lampstand tray from the Caesarea hoard. And these 2 are from another tray found in a hoard, where you have a very interesting combination here that we're going to return to later. It's one where you have both the Seal of Solomon and an interlacing rosette, a 6-petaled rosette that is interwoven with the 2 triangles of the Khatam Suleiman. And just a rather unusual example in Fatimid coinage, this is only found, in fact, in the Sicily mint in the reign of Al-Mustansir, where you have the central element is this same interlaced 6-pointed star. There are other elements that show an emphasis on 6 elements in the decorative designs. And the first is clearly evident in the mihrab of Al-Azhar, where you see a 6-petaled rosette at the very top of the soffit of the arch, but it's also on both sides of the base of the arch as well. And it's the most prominent motif in the top of the conch of the mihrab. 6-pointed stars, not necessarily intersecting like the Seal of Solomon, are also an extraordinarily popular motif in Fatimid art. So here's another example from the Mosque of Al-Haytham, where it's in the middle, dividing up these floral decoration to either side. In the Masharaf al-Guyushi again, the background of the stucco inscription at the zone of transition is also formed of these little 6-pointed stars running continuously around the zone. And dating from the late 11th century, 1091 is the mihrab at Ascalon, in which the main decorative motif again is the 6-pointed star. It occurs in the stucco decoration of the crenellations in the Mosque of Al-Akmar. This is a drawing by James Wilde from the Victoria and Albert Museum of the work, which unfortunately no longer survives. But it's also found in the facade of the Mosque of Al-Akmar, in the window grille below the lamp, of course, another too obvious symbol of light to be pursued. And a kind of 6-petaled rosette is found in the apex of the dome of Sayyida Ruqayya, whose other Solomonic references we looked at in the mihrab earlier. There are two very important portable mihrabs from shrines dating from the late Fatimid period in the Islamic Museum in Cairo, and we'll be looking at both of them. The first one we'll look at here is on the right-hand side, that of Sayyida Nafisa. We're not exactly sure of the date. It could be 1137 or 1147. But the central element that is the main focus of attention is the six-pointed star. And if you go down on either side, you can see that half six-pointed stars are prominently represented in the design as well. So here's just a close-up detail of the central star showing its importance within the geometrical composition. And if we pair up these by the miracle of Photoshop, you can see, in fact, the prominence of the six-pointed star in the recurring elements of the design. This is the Bab al-Akhdar, dating from about the same period, beside Sayyidina al-Hussein's shrine in the center of Cairo. And on the spandrels of the arch, we have two interesting motifs. In one of them, there is the intersected triangles with the hexagram for the Seal of Solomon. The other is just a six-pointed star, and they're surrounded by the polylobed elements in this case. And one wonders whether there's any connection with the interpretation of the prophet as being a rose. Now, this is found most often in much later Hilyas from the Ottoman period, although the Hilya itself, supposedly from the pen of Ali, was a document that was reproduced in much earlier times and used earlier in monumental epigraphy. So the six-petaled rosette, for instance, that we have here, or the kind of petal-like effect surrounding the hexagon, could be relevant in this context. In fact, it does even occur in conjunction with one another. The interlace, as we saw in the metalwork of the six-petaled rosette with the Seal of Solomon, is found in this example of stonework from a probably Toulonid house south of the Mosque of Ibn Tulun. And of course, it's present, as we saw before, on the example of metalwork. More examples of the prominence of the six-pointed star are from the cenotaph of Sayyidina al-Hussein, which Caroline Williams definitively dated to the Fatimid period. It was argued there that the seven-pointed star was a prominent motif and was connected with Fatimid interpretation, but to my mind, this is suspect. The Fatimids never considered themselves as seven or Ismailis. This is a modern interpretation of their doctrine. Much more important are the regular occurrences of six-pointed stars that you have throughout the design of the cenotaph. Returning to the second portable mihrab in the Islamic Museum, that of Sayyida Ruqayya. This is datable 1154 to 1160. And here too, it's a design more complicated, but also certainly one in which the six-pointed star that you have at the apex here is the most prominent example of the design. Here also in the conch, in the recess, the six-pointed star occurs again and again. And here too, the design is very carefully worked out so that the half six-pointed stars occur to either side. And again, if you just double them, you can see how prominent the six-pointed stars are all the way upwards in the design. This also has prominently featuring six-pointed stars in the decoration on the sides of the mihrab and on the back as well. You can see it here and in these panels as well. And another contemporary building, our contemporary work of art, the mimbar, dated to 1155 to 6 from the Mosque of Amri at Hus in Upper Egypt, has this wonderful design based again on six-pointed stars. There are very many kinds of them on display here. This is one with the interlacing triangles for the Seal of Solomon, just a plain hexagon inside this one, mostly filled with arabesque designs. But this one has in itself a smaller six-pointed star, or within this hexagon that is also one of the main elements of the design, you can also have a six-pointed star. And also dating from the Fatimid period, there's an adjacent mausoleum to this, which features six-pointed stars prominently in the lower part of the mausoleum, as well as in the apertures of the dome. And Dr. Bellotto in his thesis has also pointed out the resemblance of this, the Fatimid Tomb at Ghus, to this mosque lamp, probably given, as he says, by a Fatimid patron to the Great Mosque of Damascus. We also have another prominent six-pointed star in this 11th century Raqada mosque lamp. Again, I have to thank Dr. Bellotto for this illustration. In the late Fatimid dome that was added at the entrance to the Mosque of Al-Azhar, the zone of transition is, of course, 8-sided. So it's really rather surprising to find that the decoration above this is in the form of a 6-sided area with the 6-sided star at the top. And the last Fatimid monument we will look at then is the Mosque of As-Salat Al-A'ya, dating from 1160, which we looked at the hexagram from the sanctuary before, but in the narthex, the open portico that leads to it, the decoration is also based on the hexagram with 6-pointed stars appearing regularly within these. And in addition, the original doors, which are now in the Museum of Islamic Art, have the 6-pointed star prominently in the woodwork in the center here. That's a detail of this. And they're also found in the detail of the metal plated door that decorates the exterior of the monument. So we have looked at enough examples of these to show that the 6-pointed star or the 6-pointed design element was very much a favorite feature of Fatimid art. Does it occur elsewhere? Yes, but does it occur elsewhere in the same frequency and predominance that you have in the Fatimid monuments that I've shown? I don't think it does. So what kind of special meaning can we attribute to it? Well, I have to admit that I looked for some time in Fatimid religious jurisprudence sources to see what kind of connection I could find. I even wrote to Dr. Halm, who kindly responded to me with the effect that, no, there's not anything that he could think of where it was important. I wonder, in fact, if the evidence could be hidden in plain sight. There are various ways of counting numbers of imams, but as far as I know, in Ismailism, Imam Ismail is considered the 6th Imam. This is a chart created by one of our panel speakers, Dr. Andani, and of course, Dr. Farhad Daftari in his interpretations of these has several examples where, again, Ismail is listed as being the 6th Imam. So this conference is taking under the auspices of the Institute of Ismaili Studies. It was at the time of Ismail that the sect was distinguished by tracing its descent from Ismail rather than Musa al-Kazim, as the Twelvers do. It's essential to the identity of the sect. And so that seems to me a good enough reason to assert the primacy of 6 in the decoration of the Ismaili works of the Fatimids that we have seen. But in addition, of course, there are possible kaleidoscopic connotations of 6-pointed stars as attributes of light associated with the deity and the prophet and his companions, and with the Imam Ismail in particular. The 6-petaled rosettes, in turn, have similar polyvalence with the Imam Ismail and the rose-like qualities of the prophet. And the hexagram, whether used purely in line form or as an epigraphic design with the name of Muhammad, also brings in associations of Muhammad's renowned predecessor Solomon, himself a byword for wisdom and protection from evil. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernard. So now we will move to our next presenter, and I have the pleasure, to introduce my dear colleague, Dr. Marcus Pilz, curator of the wonderful Arms and Armor Department at the West Coburg Art Collections. Is one of our best specialists of Abbasid and Fatimid rock crystals. The floor is yours, Marcus.
So thank you very much for the kind introduction, and also from my side, a compliment for the brilliant organization of the conference. It really works incredibly smoothly. So can you see my presentation? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. My presentation is actually a part of my PhD thesis, which I finished in 2017, supervised by Avinam Shalem, who will also be here this afternoon. I'm very happy to be and very grateful to be part on this amazing conference. And I'm also very grateful to Anna Contadini and Bernard O'Kane for already showing such amazing material of Fatimid decorative art, also because you will see quite different decorations on the rock crystal objects, which is a quite surprising fact if we think about the importance and the prominence of those pieces which show an incredible craftsmanship, an incredible level of craftsmanship, which I would say was never reached again afterwards. I would like to speak about the rock crystal Ewers, which are, of course, the topic if one discusses Islamic rock crystals. Mostly...
Marcus, can you give us full screen, please?
Oh, it doesn't work. Ah, here we go. Yeah.
Yeah.
If we speak about the Islamic rock crystal Ewers, we mostly speak about those 7 pieces, which Jeremy Jones called the Magnificent 7, and there is quite something to it. The 2 top left ones are in, the top left one is in the V&A, the following 2 in the Treasury of St. Mark in Venice, then 1 in Florence, and in the lower row you have the one now in Dallas, which is one that only recently came to the group, and then 1 in Fermo and in the Louvre in Paris. And mostly research on those pieces focused exclusively on those vessels, because they are obviously somehow related by shape. If they are also related that much by decoration, I will discuss later. But I also want to point out another group of objects which should be taken in consideration speaking about the rock crystal Ewers, because there is another group of very thin-walled pieces which also show an incredibly level of craftsmanship, very, very closely related, very similar to the one we have on the pear-shaped Ewers. You can see a selection of those pieces here, small bottles of rock crystal in the top row, in the lower row, fragments of objects, but also the little bottle from Capua Anna already showed us. And I think speaking about the rock crystal Ewers, one also should include those pieces because they show a similar craftsmanship, but they enrich our knowledge and our idea of the decorations and the variation of decorations on those pieces. The first big comparative research on the rock crystal vessels was obviously done by Lam in his publication. You can see here one page of the illustrations due to the period. It was published in 1929 and 30. The illustrations were mainly drawings, but already here you can see not just the Ewers, but also other pieces which are included as these small bottles I showed you in my last slide. And then, speaking about the question of dating of the rock crystals, we have, of course, David Storm Rice article published in 1965, where he spoke about 6 Ewers because the 7th one was not yet discovered. The dating starts with the Ewer of Al-Aziz in Venice, and Rice suggests here that this is actually the beginning of the story. And he shows us very suggestive drawings which seem to underline this argument, since he shows the tree-shaped structures on the front of the Ewers, starting with the one on the Al-Aziz Ewer, which has a rather simple design, and then it gets more and more complex through these lines until, so to say, the highlight is reached with the Ewer F, the one at the V&A. And the drawing also suggests that the craftsmanship grew in this process from these rather, well, I don't want to say clumsy, but rather simple design of the individual parts of the decoration in example A, the Al-Aziz Ewer, and the very complex, very fine, very precise, refined one in the last example. But if we compare this to the actual pieces, we can see that the drawings are not that accurate compared to the pieces themselves. If you look to the Al-Aziz Ewer on the left side, you can see how incredibly fine the craftsmanship is, with the half palmettes reduced to individual thin elements. All the interspaces are finely carved out, a very linear design, which is quite different than the drawing in the article suggests. And if you compare this to the photograph on the right side, the second Ewer, the Mufflon Ewer in Venice, you can see that the double lining and also the half palmettes are rather planar, are actually have only very thin cuts which create these inner structure, but the lines themselves are rather thick and rather planar. So it is not quite as the drawing by Rice suggested. If we look closer, this becomes even more obvious if you compare the half palmettes on the right side with the ones on the left side. It seems that the development works exactly the other way around, that we have a much more refined design on the Ewer of Al-Aziz on the left side. And this impression grows if you look at the technical execution. While the Ewer of Al-Aziz on the left side has a relief depth of up to 5 millimeters, an incredible feature if you think that the remaining wall of the rock crystal is just 2 millimeters thick. Then you have on the right side a rather shallow relief of about 1 millimeter, and therefore a much less risky technique. You have to think that the vessel originally, if you take the Fatimid one on the left side, the vessel originally had a thickness of its walls of about 7 millimeters, and then they carved away in more than 90% of the surface, basically 60 to 80% of this material, which is an incredible feature. One wrong move and you destroy the whole thing. So purely by its technique, I would say the object on the left side is clearly a much more developed and much more difficult thing to create. Here I show you both Venetian Ewers side by side to give you an idea that also the design is significantly different. And if you see the comparison of the trees on the front of the Ewers, you can see again quite clearly how the difference actually work between those two pieces. And then there is, of course, the other Fatimid piece, the one David Storm Rice was able to date due to his inscription in his article in 1965. We speak about the small ewer you can see on the lower right side in the Museo degli Argenti in Florence. And if we look to the details of the decorative features of this piece and compare it to the Al-Aziz ewer above, you can see indeed they are quite similar. So I would suggest that this is the Fatimid style of rock crystal carving. Here we have indeed two pieces which are quite similar and quite different to another group represented by the second Venetian ewer on the top right. So if we look on David Storm Rice's chronology, suggested chronology again, I would point out that maybe the Fatimid pieces are not the very beginning of the story, but the end, the absolute peak of the development. And we have also the sources. We have a huge number of written sources which mention rock crystal vessels, the use and the production of those vessels. And it's quite interesting that a huge number, or the quite overwhelming number of mentionings of those pieces in books is actually referring to Abbasid times and not to the Fatimids that we would expect. And of course, the most important source, which I am not even showing you as a text, is Al-Biruni's section on rock crystal, where he describes a fully blown industry in Abbasid times with a huge supply chain of rock crystal coming from East Africa and from Madagascar, as also Stephen Pradines could point out in his study. And there is another group of objects I would say need a reconsideration in that light, and those are the glass vessels. Ewers like this one in Corning are mostly dated to the second half of 10th century due to the dating of the common dating of the rock crystal ewers. But thinking or making ourselves free of this dating, which was in the first place based on the inscription on just one object. So due to the inscription on one object, the ewer of Al-Aziz in Venice, all those vessels were dated to the Fatimid period, and also these glass vessels. And if we try to forget this attribution, we should think anew about it. And if we compare what we can see to archaeological findings, because the glass vessels which are in the collections in London or in Corning, they are in fact not dated because they were not found on controlled excavations. But we have the piece Anna already showed us, this ewer which was found in Fustad, and it was dated to in a range from the early 10th to the late 9th century. And there we are clearly far away from the Fatimid tradition. And we have another little mosaic stone that that makes us think about or makes us questioning the Fatimid attribution or relation of those pieces. The other important finding spot of Islamic glass, which can be dated, is of course Samarra. I show you here some fragments from Samarra and bowl at Corning. So mostly these early Abbasid glasses show not the floral decorations we know from the Ewers, but they show these little processions of very stylized animals. And it is quite amazing that we can find something like this also on an example of rock crystal. I'm speaking about the foot of this chalice in the Louvre, which shows also a non-connected row of these little sitting animals, a very typical feature of Abbasid glass carving. And on the right side, I show you a vessel in San Lorenzo in Florence, which with these also very stylized birds with half palmets as wings standing behind their back. And if I compare this again to the bowl from Corning, it gets quite obvious what I want to point out, that we have similarities here. And that's the reason why I would like to put those two pieces on the very beginning of my story of Islamic rock crystal carving. And here the Fatimid production is still in the distant future. And if we compare the Florentine piece to the Corning Ewer, I would also say that there is a much closer relationship than to this one, or even to the Fatimid one, as you can see here. So, going back to David Storm Rice chronology, I would basically suggest to put it upside down. We don't speak about the Fatimid pieces as the beginning of a tradition, but as the peak of a very long development starting more than a century before. And as the core group, the first peak of this development, I would suggest this group, which is formed of the second Ewer in Venice, the Mufflon Ewer, as you saw in the very beginning, but also the Ewer at the V&A, which again show very similar features. Another piece is the rock crystal fragment in Copenhagen, you can see on the lower right, and above it, a glass fragment from Samarra with these very typical fan-like half palmets. And I would like to put this group of rock crystal objects in the surroundings of the Abbasid court of Samarra, which with this very rich art production gives the perfect backdrop for such a development of luxury objects. Coming to an end, I would like to suggest a new chronology for the Islamic rock crystal carvings with a very stylized, very Abbasid group, typically Abbasid group closely related to the surviving glass in the very beginning, a courtly group in the surroundings of the court of Samarra. Then, and this I show you just one piece in between because my time is already up. There are also intermediary groups which finally bring us to the very developed, highly developed Fatimid objects. And thereby the Fatimid rock crystal ewers are showing themselves not as so much as an individual development that just showed up in the beginning of the Fatimid rule and then just faded away with the looting of the Fatimid treasury, but as the peak of a very long development starting in the 9th and maybe even 8th century, and then developing step by step over centuries. And we speak about the Fatimid workshop as a branch of the Abbasid workshop, maybe of Ismaili worksmen, craftsmen that moved under Abbasid pressure to Cairo. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcus. So now we'll move to the next presentation. Dr. Jennifer Pruitt is Associate Professor of Islamic Art and Architecture at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research is very well known by the Fatimid specialists with her beautiful book, Building the Caliphate, Construction, Destruction, and Sectarian Identity in Early Fatimid Architecture. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Institute for Ismaili Studies for inviting me to this wonderful conference, particularly to Gregory for really doing such a wonderful job organizing this, and also to all of the presenters so far. This has really been a really wonderful conversation, and my only regret is that we can't be in person to continue these conversations. So let me share my screen. Hold on one second. Are you seeing anything right now? Here we go. Okay, do you see my title slide?
Yep.
Okay,
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. Scholars of Islamic art have long been enticed by the rich yet elusive visual tradition of the Fatimids. This interest is based largely on evocative tales of Fatimid artistic glory and a wealth of extant examples of figural art, which seem to fly in the face of traditional academic notions of Islamic aniconism. In this paper, I want to return to one of the most pervasive narratives regarding Fatimid art, and that is the notion of a Fatimid style, which is characterized by a love of naturalistic figuralism. I will address some of the seminal studies by Richard Eddinghausen and Oleg Grabar, who advocated for a stylistic development toward realism and whose models often remain our most influential consideration of Fatimid figuralism. Then, by examining a sample of work from a single lusterware workshop, I will demonstrate that a diversity of styles existed concurrently, representing a variety of tastes, influences, and even choices made by medieval artists and/or their patrons. In their discussion of Fatimid lusterware, scholars have offered opposing views on the context of its production. Some have considered this as an imperial privilege, while others have argued for the influence of an urban middle class. I contextualize the production of these works within a system of urbanism that transcended the boundaries of class, ethnicity, and religion in medieval Cairo. And I argue that it was this system which allowed for the artistic innovations and variety found in Fatimid art. So to introduce and kind of sum up the narrative of a kind of lively Fatimid art, I turn to a series of wooden beams believed to come from the Fatimid Western Palace, renovated by al-Mustansir in around 1058. These beams demonstrate many of the hallmarks of what is considered to be the Fatimid style. The abstract ornament, which typified earlier Abbasid art, has been relegated to these small vegetal scrolls in the background, and the emphasis is instead placed on the human figures. The figures are not static, as in their Samarran counterparts, but twist their bodies in space in the hallmark pinwheel pose, which we can see here, of the Fatimid era. demonstrating an artistic interest in movement and bodily form. And we see this form articulated in diverse media attributed to this time. So for example, we have these tiny little ivory fragments that use many of these same motifs, the delicate scroll, the figures twisting in space, even images of kind of princely activities. Here we see the pinwheel pose. And art historians have used these stylistic similarities to deem these pieces Fatimid, so that we have a kind of stylistic dating. As in so many other areas of medieval Islamic art history, Richard Eddinghausen and Oleg Grabar have been two of the most influential scholars in defining the development of the Fatimid artistic tradition. Both scholars wrote articles arguing for the uniqueness of Fatimid artistic expression and attempted to trace the development of a Fatimid style. And as so much of our understanding of Fatimid art today is predicated upon these scholars' work, I want to briefly outline them here. Eddinghausen first outlined the development of Fatimid art in his 1942 Painting in the Fatimid Period, a Reconstruction. In this, Eddinghausen considers the Fatimids as a missing link in the development of Islamic painting, noting the existence of figural work in Qusayr Amra and Nishapur in the 9th century, then Samarra a few decades later, but bemoaning the odd gap between Samarra and the 13th century manuscripts from Iraq and Syria, concluding that the Cappella Palatina in Palermo must be considered as a fully preserved example of Fatimid painting, although of course it was not Fatimid at all, but commissioned by a Norman king, Roger II. Eddinghausen doubled down on his consideration of Fatimid painting as part of a linear, traceable development in his 1956 article, Early Realism in Islamic Art. Here, he sees Fatimid painting as a link in the development of naturalism in Islamic art, which had begun in Samarra, developed under the Fatimids, and continued to develop under the Mamluks, Behzad, and the Herat school, through the Safavids, Ottomans, and Mughals. By considering the Fatimids as a link in this development, Eddinghausen suggests that Fatimid art also developed linearly, bridging the gap between Islamic cultures regardless of geographical and temporal distance. Of course, there are a number of methodological issues with this. By considering Fatimid art as a missing link, he assumes that Islamic art developed along a trajectory which is unified by its Islamicness. Given the few dated examples at our disposal, the consideration of this trajectory forces us to place artistic styles within a linear progression. We might even question his approach to Fatimid realism, even though this is really the category that's stuck around, a notion of a Fatimid realism. He suggests that Fatimid realism is in opposition to earlier abstraction, with both characterized in terms of its dynamic depiction of the human form, and suggests even that Fatimid scenes might be drawn from life. And in many ways, this consideration of realism acts as a response to traditional linear models of artistic development in the Western art historical tradition. So he's elevating the Fatimids by tracing this, in which scholars chart a development from the medieval period toward increasing naturalism and drawing from life. Indeed, Eddinghausen even considers Fatimid art as a kind of renaissance of the ancient Egyptian and Hellenistic form. This characterization places tremendous value on the role of painting in the history of Fatimid culture and advocates for the Fatimids as a linchpin in the development of Islamic art history. For many years, Eddinghausen remained the primary source on the evolution of the Fatimid style. The next broad, influential discussion of Fatimid art was Oleg Grabar's Imperial and Urban Art in Islam, the subject matter of Fatimid art, published in 1972. In this essay, Grabar relies on many of the same stylistic analyses used by Eddinghausen. However, he uses these stylistic observations to link the Fatimid style to a wider cultural framework and historical exploration. Grabar primarily considers painted lustreware, though he also briefly considers woodwork, ivories, rock, crystal, metalwork, and other portable arts. Although it's not clear how he dates these pieces, Grabar also traces the development of Fatimid art from an earlier abstracted style to its more dynamic, figural, or spatial style, which he praises for its innovation. He suggests that this style became quite popular quite suddenly and represents a broad change of taste in the mid-11th century. And he links these changes to a wider Mediterranean context by relating them to the so-called Macedonian Renaissance of Byzantium. Despite the lack of materials, Grabar postulated that this shift of taste was facilitated by the looting of the Fatimid treasury in 1067 to 68. As a result of this event, Grabar suggests that imperial art objects were distributed and sold throughout Cairo, familiarizing the urban public with the figural forms found in the palace. And thus he argues, by doing this, the, quote, Muslim tradition of a private palace decoration of human figures and scenes involving people suddenly appeared to all. So in this narrative, we're looking here at the kind of map of the Fatimid palace city, Al-Qahira, and the kind of urban areas of Fustat Mosque. And so he's saying, here are the figural forms that the palace loved. They also had a bunch of Byzantine material. And then all of these get spread and the population is enlightened and adapts this figural form. Most scholars, including Eddinghausen and Grabar, have accepted the importance of lusterware in understanding this Fatimid style and have relied on the paintings found on these vessels to trace developments in painting itself. Indeed, lusterware is a particularly informative medium, as there is an abundance of extant examples, a few dated pieces, and quite a number of signed works. However, like most Fatimid object categories, the discussion of lusterware becomes quite tricky as historical sources pay it little attention and so many objects lack provenance or even the solid footing of authenticity for many of the reasons that Stéphane so eloquently described on our first day. So, but I just want to show you a kind of selection of painting on lusterware where we see lots of human figuration. This was a particularly favorite scene for Eddinghausen of a groom and a giraffe, which he suggests might be drawn from life. There are other scenes that suggest a kind of engagement with everyday life, a cockfighting scene that Fahmida Suleiman has written really very eloquently about, an old man with a cheetah, this kind of love of depicting real life. But we don't know a lot about where these came from, when they were made. Much of our assessment is based on kind of stylistic comparison. So in order to consider this relationship, this development of a Fatimid style, I'd like to turn to a series of luster ceramic objects which can be dated to the early 11th century. Namely, a corpus of luster objects signed by one potter, Muslim bin al-Dahhān, or the Muslim, the son of a painter, either done by this one person or more likely his workshop. A good bit of this corpus has been published by Marilyn Jenkins Medina. Some was also covered in the 1999 Fatimid conference organized by Marianne Barrocan with an essay by Victoria Meineke-Berg. Anna Contadini covers much of this in her Fatimid art book as well. However, the whole corpus has yet to be considered together. Today, I want to consider a few selections to question what we might surmise from this group of objects and how it might help us reconsider Eddinghausen and Grabar's initial theses. Scholars have gained particularly valuable information from an inscription of a plate fragment, which is now in Athens. And so we see an inscription here. It's very hard to read in this slide. The inscription reads, Muslim son of al-Dahhān to please Hassan Iqbal al-Hakimi. Although Hassan Iqbal has not been identified specifically, the title al-Hakimi suggests that he was a courtier of al-Hakim, who of course ruled from 996 to 1021. In addition to offering a rough date, this inscription helps us associate the fragment with dozens of luster objects which bear this signature, Muslim or Muslim bin al-Dahhān. The presence of this signature does not necessarily indicate the work of one artist, but more likely suggests production under a single workshop. However, its presence allows us to place this corpus of objects within a similarly dated framework and examine an important case study of Fatimid production. I'm showing you here a group of objects that bear Muslim signature. You can see that they're extremely diverse in subject matter and artistic technique. Although all the objects are executed in luster, they incorporate a wide range of stylistic characteristics, demonstrate both figural and non-figural motifs, and they even vary according to quality. The dating for Muslims' works under the reign of Al-Haytham and their incorporation of many of the supposedly new Fatimid themes that Eddinghausen and Grabar outline help us to disprove Grabar's contention that the Fatimid innovations were inspired by the looting of the treasury, as we can see that Fatimid figuralism and naturalism was in full swing even before the looting of the treasury. In some examples from Muslims' workshop, as we see here, the so-called Hellenistic style is employed, such as in this banquet scene now in Athens. In this example, white figures are set against a dark background. The folds of their garments are clearly articulated in fine lines, indicating the bodies that are beneath the clothing. The articulation of the folds helps us to observe the position of the limbs and torso, which is similar here in the seated figures. And many examples of this Hellenistic style are found beyond the context of Muslims' workshop as well. We can also find the popular Fatimid motif in Muslims' depiction of a heraldic eagle, now in the Metropolitan Museum. In this instance, the eagle is depicted in bold outline of various thicknesses, which are painted on a white background. This work also incorporates the peacock eye motif as a decorative background, a motif commonly used in earlier Abbasid lusterware. And of course, the heraldic eagle itself is a popular Islamic motif. Now, I find this example particularly compelling. So I'm returning to this groom with giraffe I showed you earlier. And then we have a series of fragments that show a very similar kind of scene. This is, again, one of the key pieces Eddinghausen used to discuss Fatimid naturalism. These are fragments signed by Muslim, and it's been recreated by Meineke Berg in her article in L'Egypte Fatimide. And it shows the same depiction, but a mirror image, right? So we have this groom with giraffe in a pinwheel pose, but it's mirrored and repeated. Marilyn Jenkins has argued that this suggests they were done by the same workshop. However, I am not convinced that these were necessarily executed by the same workshop, but may simply be multiple renditions of a popular subject. In other words, there's no reason to think that they were part of Muslims' workshop, this one. Indeed, the similarity of works signed by Muslims' workshop with non-signed pieces suggests an awareness of other artistic styles and a system of prototypes in which motifs were copied and new paintings were modeled after previous styles rather than exhibiting a signature style associated with the workshop's production. Thus, it is important to note that Muslims' workshop did not produce one-of-a-kind objects, but that subjects and styles were consciously reused and copied. In her essay in L'Egypte Fatimide, son art et son histoire, Victoria Meineke Berg has proposed that this development of style all occurred within Muslims' time. However, I believe it is more reasonable to conclude simply that these styles coexisted and that the workshop had a choice of which style and subject matter to depict. Thus, the example of Muslim may be seen as illustrating not a change in taste, as Grabar has suggested, but a diversity of taste and quality at a given moment, which is reflected in artistic variety. It also suggests the presence of a certain amount of flexibility, artistic agency, and conscious stylistic choice that scholars rarely allow for in the medieval period, when so much of what we do is thrust into dynastic categories. While Islamic art historical scholarship has focused on dynastic attribution and development over time, the case of Muslims suggests a greater range of artistic choices available to a given workshop. Indeed, although these objects are generally considered under the rubric of Fatimid art, this title suggests an imperial association. Unfortunately, we possess little direct knowledge regarding the patronage of such objects. While most scholars have agreed that luster production was relatively expensive, it is impossible to know exactly how costly these objects were. Clearly, it was far less expensive than the precious metal objects and textiles that were associated with the court, and thus the production of luster objects was not necessarily a purely royal prerogative. Certainly, some objects express a direct relationship with the court, as the example of the Al-Haytham. Moreover, depictions of rare animals such as a giraffe suggest royal associations, while the stylistic similarity between some objects and clearly royal commissions, such as the palace beams, further indicate some synergy with the Fatimid court. Other examples suggest particularly clearly that this workshop did not exist within a strictly courtly context. Specifically, this plate in Cairo features an interlaced star, in this case a 5-pointed star, with pseudo-Kufic writing, done in a way seemingly to evoke the floriated Kufic of the Fatimid court. It is unlikely that this meaningless pseudo-Arabic would be produced for the literate Fatimid court. However, its existence suggests that written Arabic was considered prestigious and that the class for whom this object was produced understood this prestige and wished to emulate it, even though they could not understand the written language. Most significantly, although the pseudo-Kufic decorates most of the star, the center is legible here, albeit messy. Arabic script reading work of Muslim bin al-Dahhān of Masr. Now, Masr could indicate a few things here. It could suggest that this was meant for export to faraway lands who might care about Egyptian origins. Another possibility is that Masr refers to Fustat Masr. In other words, distinguishing its place of production as separate from the palace city of Al-Qahira. In both instances, its existence helps us to broaden our consideration of Muslims' workshop beyond a purely courtly context. It also suggests a dialogue between classes or cultures in which the imitation of the Arabic script most likely represents a desire to imitate the high literate court of the Fatimids. Our ability to date objects produced under Muslims' workshop to roughly the time of Al-Haytham makes it unlikely, makes it unlikely that these new expressions were inspired by the looting of the treasury, as Grabar suggests, as these innovative new forms were in evidence prior to this event. Moreover, it is unlikely that a single event would inspire an entire artistic movement like this. However, although we may dismiss this component of Grabar's argument, what can we say about his idea of an urban bourgeois class of patronage, a non-royal art market, and the interaction of the local and urban versus the international and princely? In the context of courtly ceremonial practices, Paula Sanders has argued that at roughly this moment, we find an increased ceremonial relationship between Al-Qahira and Fustat Masr, demonstrating that Fatimid ceremonial not only became more universally meaningful through the dynasty's reign, but the imperial procession literally interacted more closely with the civilian population. As an example, she points to a 10-12 procession of Al-Haytham from Cairo to Fustat, in which commoners paraded between the caliph and his entourage, thus offering an example of direct interaction between courtly and popular life. She also posits that urbanism became the defining characteristic of Fatimid ritual and a lingua franca that united the civilian population of the dynasty with the imperial court. Ultimately, I think this is a very useful model in considering the context of artistic production and style. Perhaps the most intriguing feature of this urban system, as in the art itself, is in its striking heterogeneity. Not only did Fatimid's ceremonial urbanism incorporate the court, the bourgeoisie, scholars, and the masses, it bound Shi'i Muslims, Sunnis, Christians, and Jews in a system that was meaningful for and shaped by all. Thus, our consideration of the development of the Fatimid style, particularly in lusterware, should not be limited to a discussion of the imperial, the Islamic, or strictly defined styles. Instead, it transcends these boundaries and it's defined by its heterogeneity, its urbanism. Considering the Muslim workshop in the context of Eddinghausen and Grabar's arguments, I would agree then with Grabar's suggestion that the subjects and styles on Fatimid luster objects are the result of exchange between the culture and the urban bourgeoisie. However, these examples complicate the top-down model he suggests, in which the style of the Cairene court filtered down to the population of Fustat Masr. It also destabilizes notions of linear stylistic development that art historians so often use for object attribution. Perhaps ultimately, these luster objects are most remarkable in demonstrating the diversity of form in a single period, reflecting the heterogeneity and dynamism, even cosmopolitanism, of medieval Egyptian urbanism and artistic expression. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. So now we will move to our the last speaker of this panel. So I have the pleasure to introduce Gregory Williams, who is doing his doctoral studies at the University of Bonn. He is a field archaeologist. This is very good, and he will now present exciting results on the Fatimid city of Aswan. So please, Greg, enlighten us with your discoveries.
And thank you very much to Stéphane and thank you to Gregory Villado and the conference organizers for the chance to be with you all. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm really, to be at a conference with so many people whose work I've read so much over the years, really honored to be here and honored to be a part of this panel, truly. So I'm working in Aswan, of course, a very different region than Cairo. So I'll begin with a brief background on the city and then review several areas of excavation and their finds, which I think have helped to delineate the extent of the Fatimid era city and are useful in exploring connections and relationships with neighboring regions, both within and beyond the medieval Islamic world. Slide. Aswan and the greater First Cataract region have been described as a frontier region at the edge of the Islamic world, at the edge of Egypt. An Arab garrison was reportedly established there in the 7th century, and the city served as a capital for the governor to administer the province of Upper Egypt. So while Aswan is often characterized as a military frontier or post to regulate and exchange with Nubia, during the Fatimid period, the city appears to have been part of an active economic network operating across the First Cataract. The gold and emerald mines throughout the Eastern Desert, notably in the Wadi al-Laki, have been reinvigorated for the first time since the New Kingdom. An explanation for this greater regional interaction during the Fatimid period may relate to the Fatimid relationship with the Banu Khans, whose influence over the region was crucial. With the Khans al-Dawla sort of ruling in Aswan, the routes crossing to the Red Sea and access to the gold mines were more secure. And with good relations with the eparch or viceroy in Lower Nubia, the merchants of Aswan benefited from the residual wealth of the mines and slave trade. Aswan under Fatimid administration was a hub connected to sources of gold and precious stones, trade networks, and important routes not only for pilgrimage, but for the dissemination of knowledge. Slide, please. Aswan's probably best known for its funerary stelae, cemeteries, and especially the prominent mausoleums you see here. I suppose in the context of the conference, of course, Aswan is also associated with more recent commemorative architecture as the place of the Aga Khan mausoleum built in the 20th century on the west bank of the Nile. I won't go into great detail of these cemeteries or their mausoleums, but I do think recent conservation work by the German Institute in Cairo has helped to support earlier assertions that the more prominent mausoleums can be associated with the Fatimid period. But there is also a real settlement here. There's a real city, and I would argue it reaches its apex in scope and population size until modern times, of course, during the same period when many of these prominent mausoleums of the cemetery are being constructed. Part of why the city itself has not been considered quite as much maybe due to the fact that it's covered by the modern day city. So I think also limited historical descriptions of the medieval city, I think, make archaeological evidence all the more valuable in providing a local perspective. Slide, please. Fortunately, over the course of the past 20 years, the Swiss Institute in Cairo and the Ministry of State for Antiquities have run a joint mission in the European salvage or rescue excavation model. As you can see, these are often tight urban excavations on short schedules, quite different from the very open excavations we saw in Fustat, for example. The areas we'll look at today were led in the field by Wolfgang Müller, the Deputy Director of the Swiss Institute. Over 100 sites have now been excavated in the city, and these efforts paired with geoarchaeological drillings have helped to trace the limits of the city through the centuries. There's now ongoing studies of Arabic and Coptic ostraca, glass finds, fauna remains, and many others have worked to document numismatics, lithic finds, and ceramics throughout the city. So my discussion today relies heavily on the work of these specialists and archaeologists, but I think especially the last 5 years have been very important for documentation of the medieval city. And while excavations have helped to show connections with Cairo and the greater Mediterranean, the evidence also speaks to less considered connections with other parts of Africa, especially with the Eastern Desert and Lower Nubia. Please slide. One of the more important resources in early seasons of this project was the 19th century map of Aswan and Elephantina Island. It fairly accurately depicts the arrangement of the city in the Fatimid period, including a city wall, which had begun to be covered by the development of the modern city of the time. Here you can see the Islamic necropolis sort of spreading out to the south beyond that wall. The modern town developed to the north. And you can note the proximity here to Elephantina, a kind of harbor area situated there, and the prominent outcropping above it. Connected to the so-called Arab granite wall. We'll look at three areas in the city in particular. If you flick the slide, please. The city wall in this important sector of the southern city connected to the necropolis. In the center here, one of the few ancient sites noted on this map is the Domitian Temple, which is still visible today in Area 3. And then we'll look quickly at a third area to the north, which helps to delineate the eastern edge of the city in the Fatimid period. Slide, please. In a similar fashion to the zone of the southern necropolis, three areas are protected in Aswan for ongoing investigation. Area 3 includes one of the better preserved medieval town quarters in the city. A retaining wall was constructed in 2014 to protect the site from collapse. And during conservation measures, some of the medieval town quarter was studied, but requires further excavation. The domestic quarter was occupied since the Ptolemaic period and was probably still in use in the Mamluk period based on numismatic finds. The quarter includes a well-preserved city street with series of houses on either side built onto the Roman temple. Highlights from the work in 2014 included a plaster prayer niche located in one of the rooms similar to open-air prayer spaces nearby in the necropolis, along with another very well-preserved, another room including a well-preserved oil press, one of the best examples of an industrial installation in the city. Other finds included basketry products and carved wooden objects. And lastly, the hydraulic infrastructure, including wastewater channels, ran east-west from the houses and drained into circular pit constructions. Slide, please. More work in Area 3 here. Actually, if you click, it highlights. If you just click the slide, I think we'll highlight where Area 3 is in the center here. Has shown how organized and centrally planned the hydraulic infrastructure of Aswan was. Perhaps even before the Fatimid period, but certainly during and after. The image on the left shows one of these circular shafts revealed during the 2018 field season in Aswan. Constructed with fired bricks, it was used for the disposal of wastewater. Similar systems like this have been found in RC excavations at Fustat and were dated there to the Fatimid period. Septic tanks like this or other pits were often connected and constructed before the domestic structures were built, indicating an organized planning of these systems throughout Fustat. Later on in 2019, debris removal north of the temple in Area 3 revealed a medieval canal system partially preserved, which may have originally run north-south through the domestic quarter. These recent seasons helped to further elucidate these disparate features, lime plastered channels, brick shafts scattered all over the town, into a more coherent picture of a centrally organized sewage management system used during the Fatimid period. Slide, please. Now, about 30 meters west of the medieval city quarter in Area 3, an important rescue excavation helped to define the western edge of the city beneath the sector of the modern-day German hospital in Area 52. A wall was found sitting on granite outcroppings and a granite debris foundation featuring an arched gateway made of fire bricks. This was the medieval riverbank. It's possible that a water-raising device was located in the vaulted corridor east of the gate and worked to supply to tanks at the top of the wall. The wall was subsequently covered by compact Nile silt, possibly the result of flooding during the 19th century, and gradually the city's edge has moved west over time. Slide, please. So geoarchaeological drillings combined with these rescue excavations have begun to make a map of Aswan through the centuries. The Ptolemaic period marks the establishment of a sizable settlement on this side of the Nile, and a cemetery developed north of the center during the Roman period. By the 8th or 9th century CE, the city had grown well beyond the Greco-Roman necropolis. The medieval embankment in Area 52 was probably located along a curving shoreline situated between the modern Ferial Gardens, that's that outcropping to the south, and another outcropping sort of in the north, which is sometimes called the Roman Pier. This would have formed more or less a harbor. Remains of piers in areas further north suggest the riverbank followed the general course as today. but sat further east, very close to the modern Souk Street. This is, you can sort of see a purple line here. Actually, this may have operated in a very similar function in Fatimid times. To the east, beyond the city wall, a low-lying depression was probably always uninhabitable, and the medieval city was lined by cemeteries to its south and its east, increasingly growing north into the urban and growing into the urban fabric during the medieval period. If you click the slide, please. So this generally is the extent of the medieval city, but one of the goals for the Swiss Egyptian mission was to better understand the development of the city within the medieval period, to trace changes from the 7th century to Mamluk times, when the city seems to have been largely abandoned. Slide, please. Much of my own work in Aswan has been devoted to documenting medieval finds, usually the most common thing you find in rescue excavations. One of the more unique aspects of the salvage excavations is that they often produce long stratigraphic sequences, continuous occupation from late Roman tombs to medieval houses to modern apartments. So it provides a great opportunity to trace changes in the material culture through this period. There are several general phases which help to track settlement shifts or new developments in the city within the medieval period. These are relative changes over time, and the absolute dates are largely derived from associated numismatic finds, along with a taxonomy established by Bill Adams, who worked for many decades in Nubia and created a system for documenting changes in the pottery. My impression, based on ceramic analysis of about 15 different areas throughout the city, is that the most common material by far is from that middle group. So from the sort of Fatimid and Ayyubid period. The city really appears to expand just before and during the Fatimid period. And a good example of a sector of the city which grew at this time is in the south at the area of the city wall. Slide, please. Undoubtedly, this area was an increasingly important sector of the city in the early Islamic and Fatimid periods. A prominent rectangular building was excavated here just south of the modern cathedral in Area 32. Work revealed a massive multi-room structure built atop a dense heap of late Roman pottery. There was little evidence found to indicate a function for this structure, though in later phase it seems to have been used for stables. The ceramic material from the construction layers just below the floor surface is dated to the 9th to 10th century. Numismatic evidence found within the walls also provides a terminus postquem for the same period. According to our 19th century map, this would have been a major structure just inside the southern city wall. But for much of the mission, there was no evidence of this wall, no conclusive evidence of this wall. Also drawn on the map was a major installation sitting above the harbor. According to surveys by the Comité in the early 20th century, this outcrop was covered by a complex of mud brick remains referred to as the Kasr Mullah. Comité inspectors suggested this was originally a fortification, would have been originally much larger. The more recent work here revealed conclusive evidence for the existence of the city wall. You can see this in Area 86. The construction of a city wall, as well as the prominent building inside in Area 32, indicates the southern sector of the city went through a major renovation, increased urbanization, not earlier than the 9th or 10th centuries. Slide, please. I expect the wall discovered in Area 86, which we'll look at momentarily, was just a part of a curtain wall connecting more sturdily built towers or bastions. You can see the most prominent bastion here in a 19th century photograph of the city. Area 86 is located just beyond this bastion. And in the distance are two very important monuments, one a mosque and tomb complex destroyed in 1901. Noted the mosque and mausoleum of the 77 governors. This monument featured a distinct 9-bay hall, an architectural form found in mosques from Spain to Central Asia. Beyond it is one of the largest structures of the cemetery, the Mashhad of Aswan, which resembled some of the mausoleums in Cairo. And both structures very likely date to the Fatimid period. The expansion of the city in the southern sector began before the Fatimid period. And there was also already a necropolis at this time, as attested by the numerous funerary stelae found there. Those stelae suggest people from North Africa, Iraq, other parts of Egypt, many from Arabia were buried in Aswan. Occupations listed in the stelae include craftsmen like carpenters and blacksmiths, vegetable sellers and silk traders, fishermen, those involved in the slave trade. But it's during the Fatimid period that you begin to see this serious investment in commemorative monuments and larger religious structures just beyond this wall here. Slide, please. Area 86 was a particularly difficult rescue project in Aswan. In the construction of a new mall, this area was being bulldozed, and the team had just a few weeks to document a huge site. An Italian project in Aswan working in the early 20th century also documented towers further north and east of here. So some sections of the wall were quite impressive, but the mud brick wall discovered in Area 86 was rather modest. Ceramic finds from the wall's foundation and associated structures suggest that the wall was constructed no earlier than the 9th century. We're going to focus in particular here on the adjacent structures built onto the wall, and we'll look at some material from domestic area that developed north of the wall in subsequent periods. Slide, please. Area 86 included several houses with nicely paved floors and nicely paved floors of fired bricks. This complex included a furnace, evidenced by layers of charcoal ash and burnt mud, and a well-preserved central drainage system. These houses had courtyards and evidence of tree pits therein. A great deal of medieval pottery was found within and between the houses. In room 2 of house 1, for example, a wall collapsed in one piece, sealing much of the material below. The domestic quarter grew quickly after the construction of the wall, and much of the occupational debris likely dates to the Fatimid or possibly the Ayyubid period. Slide, please. And actually, if you could click the slide again. Thank you. A special kind of kaolinitic clay can be mined in the Aswan region, often referred to as Aswan pink clay. So not surprisingly, the majority of medieval finds are of Aswan ware. These are the typical cookpots, bowls, platters, storage and transport wares of the Fatimid and Ayyubid era city. In addition to the great quantities of this ware in Aswan, they become very common throughout Lower Nubia, to the point that Adams suggested they were made exclusively for export to Nubia. A few complete examples of sphero-conical vessels, a somewhat enigmatic object in studies of medieval Islamic material culture, were also uncovered here. It's worth noting that they share the same clay fabric as the other Aswan wares, and numerous misfired examples of these kinds of vessels were found in the north of the city in a waste deposit in Area 91. It's the best evidence to date of local production of medieval pottery in Aswan. I also note, I appreciate that many pictures of cooking pots usually puts people to sleep. So I will show a few more images of pottery finds, but just to highlight some indications of use or connections to other regions. Next slide, please. And if you could just click the slide twice, yes. Aswan never had any imported Chinese pottery as far as I've seen, and finds may not be as impressive as those in contemporary Cairo, but pretty much all of the major types of Egyptian glazed wares were also found in medieval Aswan, including lusterwares and sgraffito. By this period in Area 86, crushed quartz or stone paste are being employed for glazing pottery in conjunction with the more common marl or desert clays used to make simple monochrome bowls. Most typical in this region are dull green with black decoration or this kind of pasty yellow. Could you click again, please? Thank you. Also rare but significant here were Nubian painted wares. So material did come from production centers in Lower Nubia, and in some places even much further south. I've sort of highlighted, illustrated the lines here because it's difficult to see the burnished decoration in the photograph of the bowl on the top of the image, but bowls painted with cream designs or burnished with these splayed arm crosses have been found in medieval Soba, for example, near the confluence of the Blue and White Niles. Definitely more Egyptian pottery is imported into Nubia than vice versa, but domestic assemblages like this in Aswan do show the exchange was not entirely one-sided. Slide, please. Thank you. The final area I want to show is to the extreme north. You can see it's one of the more northeastern sites on the map. So we move sort of to the north of the city and also move back in time chronologically a little bit. Slide, please. Area 31 was very important for determining the extent of the city and the cemetery, and another situation where both domestic architecture and hydraulic systems were well preserved. The drainage system ran to a collecting tank with a conduit covered in lime plaster made of fired bricks. If you could click the slide, please. Much like those discussed in Area 3. So again, to see these kinds of systems in the far north and south suggests some communal planning here as the city grows in the medieval period. This is one of the nicer domestic quarters in the city. In the room of a house whose finds were sealed below a collapsed vault, were excavated in the earliest layers of the area, probably dating to the 8th or 9th century. Slide, please. The vault of House 1 had collapsed into the room at some stage, and directly on top of this collapse and subsequent debris were built several tombs. If you could click again, please. Yeah, thank you. The two preserved tombs relate to type 2, the tomb typology created by the DEI project working in the Southern Cemetery. In all, there were 7 human burial pits, but only 2 had these superstructures. In this case, we have some indication of the encroachment of the Islamic necropolis into the eastern edges of the city in the Fatimid period. But it's worth noting that Christian burials were documented just to the north and west in Area 49. So in the same general part of the medieval city, both Muslim and Christian interments could be found. What is exceptional here in Area 31 is that associated with the strata of the tombs was a cooking hearth, visible in the image here on the left. If you move to the next slide, the hearth was situated directly above the collapsed vault of the house. I think I'm running short of time here, so I won't go through all of the finds, but I'll just say generally that shows a lot of evidence of local Aswan wares, but also some more important connections to material from Nubia, and also from the Eastern Desert. So finds that are really only found in the Eastern Desert. If we just skip to the end here, I'll just wrap up generally. With so many plots excavated, broader maps can now be drawn tracing the extent of the medieval city of Aswan, and importantly, its relationship to the necropolis during the Fatimid period. While the northern sector was marked more by markets and industrial areas, the southern city included an important commemorative and religious space directly adjacent to developing domestic areas in the south. Ultimately, I find the work in Aswan as a compromise between alternative prevailing views. It was certainly more than just a cemetery, and Aswan in the Fatimid period greatly outgrows any previous settlement here. It was the city amongst settlements in the region, incorporated many of the same things as Cairo and Fustat: a city wall, organized hydraulic and waste management systems, a growing necropolis which expanded around the eastern side of the city with many mosques and commemorative structures. But at the same time, the overall finds are rather modest and relative, of course, to the grandeur of Cairo, and the population of medieval Aswan was probably never reached the 20,000 persons reported by al-Makrizi. While we know that people were traveling through Aswan to and from other places to the parts of the Islamic world for purposes of trade and pilgrimage, the archaeological evidence, especially material culture, also show connections to places we do not hear quite as much about in historical sources such as medieval Nubia or the lands of the Beja and mining settlements in the Eastern Desert. I'm sorry I went over time, and I apologize for problems with the slide, but thank you very much for the chance to talk, and thank you for the assistance.
Okay, welcome to the afternoon session at the Institute of Ismaili Studies here in London. It's 3 o'clock GMT, and we will continue with Fatimid Decorative Arts and Archaeology Part 2. The host will be Dr. Simon O'Mara, who is an art historian and lecturer at the School of Oriental and African Studies in the University of London, and has recently published a very excellent book on the Kaaba in Mecca. So Dr. O'Mara, I turn it over to you.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's a very great pleasure to be asked to be a moderator of this excellent conference. The panel which I'm chairing is Fatimid Decorative Art and Archaeology Part 2, so continuation of what we started to discuss and cover this morning, well, from midday today. We have a very, very prestigious lineup for you this afternoon, some very senior figures to be presenting. And our first presenter for this afternoon is Dr. Valerie Gonzalez, who is Research Associate at SOAS, University of London, and she is a specialist of Islamic art history, aesthetics, and visual culture, topics on which she has published both extensively and pioneeringly. Her lecture for today is entitled Reflecting on Ibn al-Haytham's Science and Aesthetics as Critical Tools for the Study of Islamic Art. Dr. Gonzalez, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. I'm honored that you are chairing this session. Also, first of all, thank you very much, Gregory and Nushin and Sarah and everybody involved, and Russell and everybody involved in the organization of this wonderful conference. I'm very happy to contribute to this conference. Today, I will be not particularly entertaining because I will not show artworks. My talk will be just talking. I will actually make a point. So I will, straight away go to my document. So I would like to talk about Ibn al-Haytham. As we know, Ibn al-Haytham is a luminary of Fatimid culture that irradiated in medieval Islam and beyond. His numerous books, particularly the Kitab al-Manazir, are well studied, so there is no need to repeat their findings about optics, light, and the sensory experience. What I wish to do instead is to discuss the use of these findings for the study of Islamic art and aesthetic perception. Indeed, Islamic art historians have been regularly referring to Ibn al-Haytham in an attempt to support interpretations of artworks, reception, and perception in Islam. However, by contrast, experts in Islamic scientific and intellectual history, like Abdelhamid Sabra, Roshdi Rashed, Nader al-Bizri, and others, do not relate the Fatimid scientists' work to Islamic art making or a specifically Islamic conception of aesthetic experience or perception. The historian of Islamic philosophy and specialist of civilization studies, Nader al-Bizri, even noted that although Ibn al-Haytham elaborated his theory of vision and light in the Fatimid context, for which light constituted a highly significant theological concept, the Fatimid scientists did not consider the Ismaili or any Islamic conception of light in his work. Instead, Ibn al-Haytham approached the subject from a fundamental scientific perspective, as the Greeks did it in the past. And again, it is common knowledge that the Greek scientists, like Ptolemy, are Ibn al-Haytham's main references and source material. As al-Bizri makes it clear, I quote, "Even though Ibn al-Haytham's mathematical and optical research was foundational in the domains of the exact sciences and their scientific application, it was not in itself metamorphosed into artistic, theoretical, or practical spheres. Ibn al-Haytham's preoccupations were centered on experimental method of inquiries." Sorry, I'm sorry. Oh, gosh. I'm sorry, a little incident with the phone. So I continue with al-Bizri quotation about Ibn al-Haytham, he made a point in emphasizing that there is no theoretical or practical application of Ibn al-Haytham science. Ibn al-Haytham's preoccupations were centered on experimental methods of inquiry and controlled testing, which combined geometry with physics, and rested on studies in optics and investigating the optimal veridical conditions of visual perception, which would ground the reliable empirical recording and analysis of accurate observational data. End of quote. This discrepancy between the specialist of Ibn al-Haytham and the Islamic art historian signals a problem and raises the following questions. Did this specialist miss something? And does Ibn al-Haytham's theory truly enlighten the Islamic artistic and aesthetic culture? To answer these questions, I will examine a key art historical reference, a 2015 article in Muqarnas entitled "The Scrutinizing Gaze in the Aesthetics of Islamic Visual Cultures, Sight, Insight, and Desire." In this article, one may read, I quote, regardless of the debate on whether or not theories of visions and aesthetics had an impact on artistic production, such texts offer precious glimpses into widespread sensibilities that framed visual hermeneutics. Despite their often underestimated value, Islamic narrative sources and poetry provide valuable insights into aesthetic values that inform the modality of the gaze and attitudes toward the visual arts. End of quote. Overlooking the fact that scholars concerned with Islamic art have never underestimated the importance of foraging in the said primary sources, this statement contains several unsteady points that put in doubt the usefulness of these recurrent citations of Ibn al-Haytham in Islamic art history, beyond, of course, the obvious fact that Ibn al-Haytham books bespeak the emphasis placed on geometry, mathematics, and science in art making in medieval Islam. But this is only an obvious generalization that cannot replace an in-depth critical inquiry. Obviously, science and art in Islam cross-fertilize and still do. The first unsteady point in the said article reflects the method of piling up references to primary sources in Islamic art history without always checking or proving the critical power of these sources in relation to the reality of this art, of Islamic art. This unsteady point in the article is more precisely the indiscriminate conjunction of period texts of very different nature, of poetic, scientific, mystic, philosophical, and theological nature, vaguely called narrative. In the article, this eclectic conjunction of texts is meant to prove one single idea, which is that all these texts constitute interrelated evidences pointing to Islamic sensibilities and values that frame visual hermeneutics and reveal an Islamic approach to the visual arts. However, this very concept of sensibilities, values, visual hermeneutics, and approach to the visual arts are culturally determined concepts with which fundamental science not only by definition is not concerned, but also which are purposely avoided by scientists in order to reach out to the universal. If Ibn al-Haytham's science was a culturally determined science or a science informed by Islamic values and metaphysics, it would not qualify as science, but rather as a philosophy. And for that matter, nobody can deny that Ibn al-Haytham's theories of optics and lights and sensory perception belong to fundamental science based on a fundamentally observational method of work and not on philosophical thinking. I would say, in other words, that in the cosmopolitan Fatimid context, Ibn al-Haytham brought about the universal. He literally expanded the Fatimid milieu to the universal through his scientific practice and thinking. Even his theory of the beautiful, which is actually misunderstood as a theory, and which rather falls under the sign of a phenomenology of the beautiful, aims at the universal and the objective. In fact, although Ibn al-Haytham's aesthetics subjectively promotes notions of order and harmony and other concepts, his rationalization of the beautiful relies on very generic principle notions and physical properties such as proportions, harmony, bright colors, simplicity versus complexity, etc. These properties can be found variably employed and combined everywhere, any time in global cultural artistic history. Moreover, this phenomenology of the beautiful concerns both representational and non-representational art. Therefore, Ibn al-Haytham aesthetics is actually of very little use for solving the complex problems posed by Islamic arts, such as, for example, the functioning and meaning of non-representational ornament or the meaning of figural ornament. These are just examples. For these very reasons, citing Ibn al-Haytham work in Islamic art history incurs the danger of falling into the trap of la palissade or truism. Some recent studies on the Alhambra, for example, are replete with generalizations of poor critical reach, such as these, I quote, "Since the judgments involved in discerning geometry design are secondary to the perception of color, according to Ibn al-Haytham, one may also study such visible properties such as shape, size, position, order, and such pairs as separation and continuity or motion and rest as dependent upon the use of color." End of quote. This is a typical La Palissade. Or another one about another La Palissade or truism about the multicolored vaults in the Alhambra. I quote, this is what I came across while reading recent studies on the Alhambra. The alternation of colors in the vault also contributes to what Ibn al-Haytham discussed as the separation and contiguity of the constitutive parts of the object, that is, the boundaries of the objects and of the interval between the boundaries. End of quote. That's a La Palissade, and this type of thing can apply to virtually anything in the world, in the past and in the present. There are also the art historical misinterpretations of Ibn al-Haytham theories themselves, due to the confusion between what Martin Jay aptly calls cultural optics as opposed to scientific optics. Cultural optics is the equivalent of the culturally determined gaze and mode of seeing as opposed to physiological sight. The scrutinizing gaze that the aforementioned Muqarnas article explores is an Islamic cultural construct belonging to cultural optics, not to scientific optics. Ibn al-Haytham's scientific optics has little power to enlighten this culturally determined gaze. Yet the article argues otherwise, leading inevitably to misleading arguments. Let me explain this. According to the Muqarnas article, the Kitab al-Malnazir would help explain, I quote, the predilection of abstraction in the pictorial arts, and would also explain, I quote again, the power of the abstractive inner gaze which reigns supreme in Islamic aesthetic culture, end of quote. The Kitab would also be related to, I quote, the scrutinizing gaze, end of quote, mentioned in Ottoman sources. This reading draws on Ibn al-Haytham theory on perception that unprecedentedly distinguishes between sensation and inference and identifies the diverse levels of intensity of the act of seeing, which also depends on the configuration of the object seen that may be more or less complex. But again, Ibn al-Haytham's findings proceed from a phenomenology of visual perception applicable to any culture in any period. It does not target the Islamic gaze specifically and does not explain the Ottoman emphasis placed on the scrutinizing gaze, which, by the way, challenges the two overarching ideas in the same article and argued in the article of an inner gaze reigning supreme in Islamic aesthetic culture and of an abstracting gaze in the pictorial arts. The misuse of Ibn al-Haytham appears in particular in the systematic association between his discussions on the noetic faculties involved in perception with the falsafa and Islamic ethics that talk about the inner gaze. And aesthetic abstraction in Islam as well is associated with this discussion of Ibn al-Haytham about the noetic faculties. For what Ibn al-Haytham theory aims to demonstrate is the compound of the cognitive and psychological faculties complementing and processing the prelogical knowledge acquired through sensory perception in scientific and phenomenological terms. These faculties possess both representational and abstractive powers, in particular, eidetic powers. And this is very well explained in Al-Haytham himself and in the scholarship on Ibn al-Haytham. The fact and the matter is that Ibn al-Haytham does not address the cultural choice of activating one or the other category of powers, namely the representational or abstractive power. In this respect, Ibn al-Haytham is the precursor of different branches of contemporary sciences concerned with the perceptive articulation between body and mind, such as neuroscience and cognitive psychology, that developed over time with the aid of advanced experiments and technology. Ibn al-Haytham is also the precursor of phenomenology, about which Edmund Husserl said that it is scientific philosophy, or philosophy as science. As the contemporary phenomenologist Dermot Moran defines it, phenomenology is a mode of approach that can be used in all areas of science, but which specifically focuses on the manner objects are constituted in and for subjects, and in the consciousness of subjects. Ibn al-Haytham is in particular the precursor of the new subdiscipline of neuroscience called neuroaesthetics, which inscribes aesthetics in the scientific domain, taking aesthetics in the original Greek sense of the word that designates the information obtained through the senses. Consequently, not only Ibn al-Haytham's definition of mental psychic perception is free of philosophical, spiritual, and theological content, as the finding of the specialist of Ibn al-Haytham show it clearly, but also this definition does not describe the mental psychic perception as intrinsically abstractive, as the Muqarnas article misconstrues it. At last, a point must be made about the concept of imagination in Ibn al-Haytham's theory of perception. If, following his neuroaesthetics, the noetic perception can be both representational and abstractive, so can imagination be representational and abstractive. Ibn al-Haytham teaches us that imagination constitutes a polyvalent cognitive force. He analyzes in particular an aspect of this force, that is the compensatory eidetic ability of memory, which helps reconstitute what is absent or not visible. I would call the reconstituting imagination this form of imagination that fills the gaps in the reality perceived. As the English art historian John Onions puts it in his work on neuroscience and the arts, there are many ways in which imagination works. Hence, he aptly talks about the different type of imagination, different types. And yet, in another very recent book about Islamic art and perception, simplistically reduces Ibn al-Haytham complex concept of imagination to unbridled imagination, thus misconstruing the Fatimid scientist explanation as the proof that as a pretended proof that Islamic perception has supposedly the particularity to let imagination be free to errand and meander. In conclusion, I would like to say that it is time to reconsider the critical appropriation of Ibn al-Haytham's science and phenomenology in Islamic art history, in heeding both the fundamental differentiation between cultural and scientific optics and the fact that his findings did not inform art making and cultural perception in Islam as it did in Renaissance Europe. And there is nothing curious or abnormal in that fact. If there is a fundamental contribution of Ibn al-Haytham work in respect to Islamic art history, it is an epistemological contribution, emphasizing 2 points. First, the validity of the phenomenological method. Second, the necessity of deploying an up-to-date critical methodology for understanding Islamic art. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Valerie, for that trenchant and important critique. We turn now then to our second panelist for today's session, and that is Professor Doris Berens-Abou-Seif, who is Professor Emerita and former Nasser D. Khalili Chair for Islamic Art and Archaeology at SOAS, University of London. So significant in the field is she that she needs absolutely no introduction from me. And so with no further ado, let me hand the floor over to Professor Berens-Abou-Seif and her lecture entitled Late Antiquity in Fatimid Art. Thank you very much, Doris. It's all over to you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to say that I did not do this paper entirely alone. While I was working, I received a lot of help. So coming back to what I wanted to say, that I have to do this work today, which is very preliminary. I also had the advice and a great deal of help from Juan de Lara, and so it is a joint work. My paper is about an enigmatic marble panel in the Islamic Museum in Cairo, Museum of Islamic Art in Cairo.
Doris, I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you go full screen on the PowerPoint? We get a better picture of what we're seeing.
Yes.
Thank you, Doris.
Yeah. All right. So this is an enigmatic panel in the Museum of Islamic Art in Cairo. Although it is located in the Ayyubite Hall, its iconography and the style of its carving rather suggests a Fatimid attribution. However, some of its extraordinary features raise questions, and I cannot promise that I'm answering all this. I'll be able to answer these questions here and today. The panel consists of, which is not complete, a part of it on the right-hand side is missing, of 4 interlocked circles that include fabulous creatures. And the upper one and the lower ones show human-headed birds. The upper one is not seen here on this image, but it's the same thing. And then we see, as with these are what we call today harpies, but which rather correspond to Greek sirens or to sirens in Greek mythology, to which I shall return. There is also a winged horse, or perhaps a winged centaur, because the head looks to me rather human, although it does not quite look like a centaur, and a pair of female, respectively, coming out of a fish in the middle one, which each of them holds a cup in one hand and a bottle in the other. Here we see them closer. Then these roundels are framed on the lower part and on the side by fish, one fish with open mouth and one fish with closed mouth. So probably the context of the marble panel must have been somewhere in something residential connected to water, perhaps to a fountain or a fountain house or a residence near, not far from the water. There are other Fatimid carved panels in the Islamic Museum, in the Museum of Islamic Art in Cairo, which could be comparable in terms of style. However, the imagery is quite different because they represent real animals, not fabulous animals or mythological animals. And some of them, like the peacocks in the middle or the confronted lions, recall very much medieval, early medieval textiles of the Mediterranean world. Harpies and winged horses are occur in Fatimid art, as we can see here on this lusterware, and they also have predecessors in Coptic art. And the same thing, here we have this winged horse, which we can see here, and winged animals as well, winged animals with him in Fatimid luster, and here and other animals, and a winged horse in Coptic as a Coptic textile. The winged horse or centaur it occurs also in Fatimid and Coptic art in textiles as rather a real centaur. I wanted to say that this is here a bit of a centaur as well, because the head of the horse is very similar to that of the female figures, which suggests that it's rather meant to be a kind of winged centaur. Such hybrid mythological animals are a common motif in Mediterranean Europe of late antiquity and the Middle Ages. In the Fatimid, the iconography of Fatimid luster pottery, presentations of real animals, however, prevail: rabbits, deer, fish, birds, and lions. Fabulous hybrid animals occur only or occasionally, as far as we can tell, of course, from extant evidence. However, nowhere in Fatimid art, to my knowledge, do we see the figure of a woman coming out of a fish, or a hybrid fish woman creature, as we see here, and also neither does Eva Baer, in her study of the subject, mention such creatures of female hybrid fish and woman. The only exception I came across, does not apply for Fatimid art anywhere else, as far as I can tell. Neither does it seem to be applicable also, neither does it seem to be the case also in Islamic art in general. The only other exception, or the only exception I came across recently, is much later, and it is on a basin, most likely of late Mamluk provenance, which is in the TM, not in the storage of the TM in Istanbul. It shows the images of the zodiac, and for pieces, we see a centered figure flanked by a pair of mermaids, of really a hybrid creature. The upper part is a woman, and the lower part is a fish, and they are symmetrically arranged on both sides. In the text of the Ajaib Makhluqat and other comparable cosmological texts, but in Ajaib al-Makhluqat compiled by Qazwini in the 13th century and based on earlier text and tradition from East and West, mentions aquatic creature, but there is no reference to a woman with fish tail or a woman coming out of a fish. However, the text mentioned a fish with human head, as we can see in manuscripts of later date, and it also mentions a merman, or rather a water man, who inhabits the sea and who basically has human feature. So again, not a mermaid. Such a merman or merman, a man that inhabits the water, can be seen on the early Mamluk basin, in the bottom of the early Mamluk basin, the so-called Baptistère de Saint-Louis. Here is the drawing of by Rice, which shows it a bit clearly, and here is in the basin itself. It's very difficult to seem to recognize a kind of identified bearded man, but the body is difficult to define. Whereas aquatic female creatures or hybrid female fish do not belong to the early Islamic literary or iconographic traditions, they do have an evident presence elsewhere in the Mediterranean world. For example, in the Cappella Palatina in Palermo and in the Cathedral of Cefalù, both founded by Roger II in the first half of the 12th century. They show with a Cefalù on the left-hand side, difficult to recognize, and at the Palatina, two figures with most likely female. It's not evident, but at a closer look and by comparison, they are female creatures with fishtail. But in both cases, they seem to be wrestling. And at the beginning, they had been interpreted as wrestlers rather than mermaids. However, so this is, I would not describe this as part of Islamic art straightforward, but of course we know the strong influence of Fatimid art on Norman art, and in particular in terms of the painting of the ceiling, in particular in the case of the Cathedral of Cefalù. Aquatic creatures are also common in Antiquity and late Antiquity in the Mediterranean and in the Levant. Man with a fishtail already occurred in Assyrian and Babylonian mythology. The merman motif can be found in Greek mythology, in Nereus, a divinity of the sea, father of the female Nereids. He later became Triton and went on and continued to exist in Christian Byzantine art. Here is a Greek vase of BC, and here we see Triton in a Libyan church, in a mosaic of a Libyan church, dated to the 5th century AD. In Greek mythology, the Nereids are benevolent female inhabitants of the sea who help the sailors. They are represented often riding animals of the sea or accompanied by animals of the sea. However, they are not represented as mermaids, that is, fish woman or woman fish. Mermaids with a fish tail appear as well in late Antiquity, and we found in an early medieval Europe. We found them in Italy from the 4th to the 10th century, and very often they have a double tail. In medieval European art and literature, mermaids assumed the role of the Greek siren, who was initially a human-headed bird and a malicious symbol of seduction that through her songs, through her magic songs, drive the sailors to disaster, as narrated in Homer's Odyssey. Around sometime around the 7th or 8th centuries in European Christian literature, the siren becomes not a bird, but it mutates into a real mermaid, a fish-tailed woman, and she's quite often shown as, with a mirror and a comb in her hand. And throughout the 12th century and in Romanesque architecture, the siren became a ubiquitous motif seen in stone carving on many, so you can choose, there are a plethora of them in Romanesque churches, and mostly represented with a double tail or sometimes also with a single tail. So here, this image here shows the original siren, which is a bird or a human-headed bird, and we see it here. This is the one, like the one on our enigmatic Fatimid panel, and here it is on a famous Greek vase at the British Museum, the so-called siren vase, which shows here Odysseus and the singing sirens in this shape. And also this mutation occurs also in literature, not only in iconography, where a book called the Liber Monstrorum, an English-Latin book datable between the 7th and 8th century, describes the sirens as women now with a fish tail. And it also mentions Triton as a human-headed fish, male human-headed fish, associated with Egypt and Libya. We have already seen the Triton with a mosaic with the Triton from a Libyan Byzantine church of the 5th century. In the Renaissance literature, mermaids and mermen are associated with Egypt and the River Nile. Of particular interest is the text of a German chronicler reporting that in the year 586 AD, that is in the 6th century, 2 mermaids were sighted in the Nile. Although it is a much later source, it is noteworthy here because it associates the Nile and the 6th century, that is Coptic Egypt, with mermaids. Coming back to Egypt, mermaids appear in Coptic textiles and in sculpture, both in the pagan and perhaps in the pagan context, but perhaps also in the Christian context. We see here they're associated. The one on the left side is what we could call now a mermaid. It's a Nereid, and it's a female one. And on the other one is the male figure of the sea. Both of them are associated with the birth of Aphrodite, so in the sea. And they occur very frequently also on Coptic textiles, as we see here, and again in association with the birth of Aphrodite. However, the Coptic Nereid figures are represented, unlike the ones we have seen before, they are represented here with a fish tail. So the question is, this raises the question whether the fish tail is a novel Egyptian iconographic feature, and this still needs to be investigated. And here another Coptic textile also showing the Nereids in the more traditional form, with as riding and animals of the sea on both sides. And quite often we have a combination with a male partner and a female partner, but this seems to be female here, both of them. Now, Coptic textiles here, we see it's not very clear, 5th, 6th century textile. We see a double-tailed siren. And this one might be a siren as well, difficult to tell. It looks like, the question is whether she is wearing a dress like that or whether it is a fishtail. However, what is evident here is that the motif of the mermaid appears already in Coptic art. Now, the question is, of course, whether Coptic art had any influence on the mutation of the European siren from the bird to the fish. This is a question that I cannot answer here and which would be interesting to further explore. Women cum fish figures on our panel differ from the Coptic and other Mediterranean mermaids, including the Norman Sicilian ones, in that the female figures come out of the fish mouth and they hold a cup and the bottle in the hand. Now I have to go a bit further here. The cup and the bottle are evidently not features of the Mediterranean iconography of the mermaids, but they are a typical feature of Fatimid representation of the cycle of entertainment. We see them on ivory, and we see them also on lusterware, and we see here is our figure on the enigmatic panel. There's one panel which would, of course, be very interesting, but it has it is problematic. This shows supposedly a Coptic carving showing true mermaids, not Nereids, on each side of a tree. and they are wearing a cross. This was published in the 1960s as with the earliest representation of mermaids in Christian art. However, it has completely disappeared from publications. Later on, I tried to get hold, to inquire at the museum where it was supposed to be, where it used to be, at the Ikonen Museum in Recklinghausen, to ask why it's no longer there, it's not exhibited, and it's not published in the catalog, but I didn't receive a reply. And it has been, we know that years ago, there was a great deal of Coptic forgeries discovered on the art scene, and many of which had been purchased by a museum, and a respectable museum like the Brooklyn Museum. So there is a question mark about this panel and this carving, whether it can be taken seriously as in the context of our study here or not.
Doris, can you bring things to a conclusion?
Yes. Now, what I wanted to say is that with this Coptic and late Mediterranean connections, the marble, our enigmatic marble panel has some parallels, although not direct, with another category of carving, of marble carving of the Fatimid era, which are the Kilbes. There is no iconographic parallel directly, but also here we found themes of late antiquity, and we also find a lot of subjects that cannot be explained so far. Some of them related to Coptic art, some of them representing figures of men dressed like priests, women, female nudes, people, and figures with raised hands, which is a very Coptic feature. So there is here, this is the one thing that one can say is comparable with our Fatimid panel. The Fatimid panel has, as I said earlier, the one Islamic feature in it is the holding of the cup and the bottle, which are Fatimid feature and hence Islamic feature. So it is not a true conclusion, but I want to say here that it seems that we have here some little examples of survival of late antiquity Mediterranean and Coptic motifs that cannot be entirely identified or explained in Fatimid art. Thank you.
Doris, thank you very much for that incredibly rich, visually speaking, and in terms of content, too, lecture. Very, very interesting. I look forward to the question time on that. I turn now to our third panelist. Our third panelist is Dr. Ayala Lester, who is a curator of Islamic materials at the repositories of the Israel Antiquities Authority between 1998 and 2018, and is a specialist of early Islamic glass, metalwork, and jewellery, subjects on which she has published widely. Her lecture for today is entitled Fatimid Jewellery Hoards from Palestine. Dr. Lester, over to you.
Well, I'd like to thank Gregory and the organizers for the wonderful conference, and thank you for inviting me. 7 jewelry hoards were found, dated to the Fatimid period, were found between 1961 and 2005 in excavations in Jerusalem, Ramle, Caesarea, and Tiberias. These caches, rich in finding, reflect the economic status of the beholders and mirror information gleaned by Professor Shlomo Dov Goitein in his monumental work, Mediterranean Society. Goitein's discussions are based upon trousseaux of brides from Jerusalem and Fustat, dated between 1028 and 1156, and include women from affluent backgrounds and some with modest resources. This information reflects the strong economic situation in Palestine during the Fatimid period. Ramle, Caesarea, and Tiberias were rich cities with flourishing domestic and international trade throughout the Middle East and as distant as India and even China. However, the concealment of the hoard expresses an atmosphere of uncertainty due to the Turkmen invasions into Palestine beginning in the second half of the 11th century. Due to time limitations, I discuss 4 hoards only found at Tiberias, Caesarea, and Ramleh. I include 3 small hoards, which most probably made up a family's wealth. A cache from Caesarea reflecting a very affluent owner, and an assemblage of anklets and bracelets found in a private house in Ramleh. The hoard from Tiberias, found in 1976, is composed of a variety of jewelry pieces together with 15 dinar coins. It includes basket-shaped earrings decorated with filigree and granulation. This type of earring is of Byzantine origin and coexisted in the Fatimid world. Goitein's survey of jewelry lists different types which are mentioned in the Gnizat documents, especially Pruitt from Fustat in Jerusalem. He sometimes hesitated in the identification of a specific type, such as the basket-shaped earrings, and this task fell to the research students working with archaeological findings. The term muhammas, as discussed by Goitein, and meaning composed of 5 hemispheres, is suggested for the basket-shaped earrings, which have been found in several variations. Another common type of jewelry is a crescent-shaped earring, decorated with pearls on its lower part. Its garlic shape has provided its popular name khilaq. Thus, garlic in the torsolis meant earrings. The pearls which hung from the earrings were highly valued during the Fatimid periods and were the most prized material after gold. The fingering is made of gold wire with filigree and granulation, a technique which became prominent within Fatimid jewelry. A ball-shaped earring composed of 2 parts was produced by pressing a gold leaf into a mold which created a hemisphere. Such a mold was found together with the material vessels at the workshop which was uncovered during excavations in 1995 in Tiberias. The dinar coins were clipped and the latest dinar bore the name of al-Dahhān. Thus, the concealment of the cache is suggested to be between 1021 and 1040, the beginning of his reign, to a few years subsequent to its end. Another hoard from Tiberias was found under the threshold of a house in 2 vessels. One vessel contained 12 pieces of gold jewelry, together with 9 dinars. The jewelry pieces included a pair of basket-shaped earrings, a small biconical bead, a group of spherical beads, and 2 finger rings. The latest dinar is dated to 1063 from the regime of Al-Mustansir. The finger rings has probably been inlaid with stones. The tiny biconical bead is a variant of the large bead found at Caesarea. The star-shaped jaglet with a brownish-red slit is unique and of uncertain origin. It might be from Egypt. The second vessel, a small jaglet made of buff ware typical to the early Islamic period, included broken pieces of jewelry, beads of semi-precious stones, and 18 half-dirham coins dated between 1010 and 1033, the final years of al-Zahid's reign. These coins preceded the dinars by 30 years. All the dirhams were pierced and were probably used as amulets, not as currency. They were certainly valued for the silver, which was lacking during the Fatimid period. The hoard unearthed at Caesarea was also divided into gold and silver articles. Each type of metal was stored in a different vessel. A cache of gold pieces was hidden in a glazed juglet, and a hoard of silver anklets was found hidden in a small clay vessel. The gold cache is comprised of beads partly made of gold leaf with granulation. The central ones demonstrate superb filigree work. Apple and cherry-shaped beads are strung together with a central biconical bead. The term beaded is suggested by Goitain to mean granulated, which is likely the case with the apple-shaped bead. Each filigree bead was built upon a frame made of straight filigree wires with S-shaped wire woven through them. These in turn were filled by tiny figure-6 units. The pattern entirely covers the beads. In the Gniza documents, this complex design is termed mushabak, lattice work. The goldsmith or the sarer, as designated by Goitain, was very professional, bringing the typical Fatimid scroll pattern to an artistic peak. Also in the cache were a few beads made of amber, which appear in the Gniza documents as mufassala, intersected with gold beads. A pair of box-like crescent earrings and 2 small amulet cases are adorned with niello, mudra bis-sawad. In this particular example, I believe that Goitain was wrong. He refers to the use of niello to the 12th century, but we have evidence of much earlier use, such as the Ṣadaqa casket dated between 1044 and 1047. Amulet cases known as Maimun were meant to enclose a script with a magic formula, protecting the bearer against the evil eye. The latest article within the cache is a silver amulet with verses of Surah Al-Ikhlas. Based upon the paleographic character of the letters, it is dated to the 12th century. The silver hoard is comprised of 4 bracelets, siwar, decorated in the repoussé technique with a hexagonal pattern enclosing various animals such as peacocks, other birds, and deer. The bracelets were worn in pairs. In the Gniza document, they are described as manfur, puffed up, or swollen because of the tubular shape with pointed tips. Another term used was scorpion tail, based upon its sharp-edged tail. The torsolites do not provide descriptions of decoration, so these terminologies remain an open issue. The assemblage originating from Ramleh was unearthed in an affluent neighborhood with streets, houses, and sewage systems. The articles were packed in textile, which has not survived. It includes 9 pieces, 2 silver anklets, 2 silver bracelets, 3 bracelets made of gold, a bracelet made of silver wire, and a hoop with a suspended amulet. Some of the articles were previously unknown. Each of the silver anklets is composed of 2 parts with a hinge to open and close them. Each anklet has a granule inside which rattles while moving. Goitain refers to a woman of modest means who married in 1023, and her dowry listed a pair of silver anklets, worth 8 dinars. Goitain comments that they must have been heavy, and indeed they are. Each anklet weighs 170 grams. A pair of 2 silver bracelets and 1 of gold, decorated in repoussé, are adorned with inscriptions such as Baraka Kamila or Baraka Wires, and are decorated with scales of an eagle, a term discussed by Goitan. It probably symbolizes strength, mightiness, and courage, common qualities that each person wishes for himself. 2 gold bracelets are decorated with tiny bars and bands with scrolls and half palmets. The hinge was concealed by a spherical plate coated with granulation. These articles are large and could have been worn on the arm over the sleeve. These 2 bracelets have meticulous work and should have been quite expensive, as each one weighs about 40 grams. This is the first occurrence of this type of bracelets, both in archaeological findings and collections. Another common type of bracelet, which was found at Ramleh and Jerusalem, is a thick cord made of silver. It is always found alone and was used to keep the tucked up sleeve in place, or I would suggest to keep a packet containing money and valuables attached to the wrist. I believe it is a hadida referred to by Goitan. The last article in the assemblage from Ramleh is an amulet with a silver hook and an amulet hanging from it. The amulet is hexagonal in shape with alternating panels displaying Surat al-Ikhlas. It was commonly held that whoever learned its surah by heart was respected as if he had read a third of the entire Quran. The hoop is delicately engraved with verse 254 from Surat al-Baqarah, dealing again with the greatness and strength of Allah. The presence of 3 verses from the Quran on one jewelry piece, together with the blessing formula kept in the amulet, gives it substantial religious importance. All these articles, which appear in the trousseau list, were accompanied by a listing of the values. However, weight is never mentioned. Since the dinar weighed only slightly less than the mithqal, a denomination of 4.6 grams, the price of an ornament expressed in dinars approximated its weight. The hiding of the horse is directly related to the political situation within Palestine. The Fatimid ruled Palestine between 970 and the 12th century. However, Tiberius suffered from repeated invasions of Bedouin tribes of the Al-Jarrah family, which plundered the city. In 1071, 2 common tribes, the Hoards, invaded the city and made it the capital with the goal of conquering Palestine. A letter written in 1069, found in the Gnizah by Elia Cohen, son of Yechezkel, the community leader, to a friend in Fustat, states that no one can leave Jerusalem to reach Ramleh, and all the roads are insecure. Whoever comes and goes endangers himself. The situation along the seashore was different. Caesarea was a flourishing city described by Nasser Husserl as being surrounded by a wall with water systems and citrus trees. The hordes from Tiberias mainly included the private wealth of families who tried to contend with the dynamic events of the period. These hordes present a few significant groups of jewelry. The basket-shaped earrings are typical of Syria and Asia Minor. This group is absent from other areas in Palestine. including the coastal towns and Jerusalem. The group of jewelry made using filigree and granulation is dominant in Caesarea, and these types are quite unique. Furthermore, we can suggest types typical to northern Palestine, which are of Syrian influence, while the Caesarea group was composed under Egyptian inspiration. Caesarea during the Fatimid period was culturally identified with Egypt. Thus, cultural differences are exposed in the jewelry groups discussed in the paper. We are fortunate to be able to identify archaeological finds through Goitan's careful analysis of the Niza documents, which exposes us to a rich field of Fatimid material culture. Thank you.
So our fourth panelist is Dr. Fatimid Suleiman, who is currently curator of the Islamic World Collections at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, in Canada, and who also teaches courses on Islamic art at the University of Toronto. She has published widely and extensively on Islamic art, and her lecture for today is entitled Looking Eastward, Central Asian and Chinese Inspirations in Fatimid Art. Dr. Suleiman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Simon, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to all the organizers of the conference for inviting me. It's absolutely wonderful and an honor to be here. Okay, here we go. Between the years 1050 and 1058, Al-Hasan ibn Ali al-Yazuri, vizier to the Fatimid Imam Caliph al-Mustansir Billah, summoned two renowned painters, the Egyptian Al-Qasir and the Iraqi artist Ibn Aziz, to an opening assembly or majlis to demonstrate their talents and be judged in front of an audience. The artistic rivals worked on opposite sides of the hall, using the walls as their canvases, and both of them chose to paint images of dancing girls as their subjects. The tension in the majlis hall was palatable, as Al-Qasir, infamous for demanding extravagant wages and for his arrogance concerning his abilities, depicted a dancer in a white garment within a niche painted in black, giving the appearance of her entering into the wall. Not to be outdone by his rival, Ibn Aziz painted a dancer in an eye-catching red garment within a yellow niche, portraying her as though she were emerging from the wall. Not surprisingly, the mainly Egyptian audience was more impressed with Al-Qasir's efforts in the competition. Nonetheless, al-Yazuri enjoyed the event tremendously and presented both artists with robes of honor and bags of gold. Although we are fortunate that this account was recorded by the Mamluk historian al-Makrizi in his Khitat, we have absolutely no idea what the actual paintings looked like or what form of dance they depicted. In this presentation, I wish to analyze the image of the dancer in Fatimid art within the context of the dynasty's aspirations to foster a cosmopolitan court culture and against the historical backdrop of its flourishing trade and diplomatic contacts with Central Asia and China. Oh dear. The appearance of dancing girls in the artistic repertoire of Muslim dynasties predating the Fatimids is well established. The image on the left is a portrait of a female dancer painted on the southern arch of the audience hall at Qusayr Amr, the 8th century Umayyad desert palace in Jordan. The one on the right is a reconstruction of the wall painting of two dancers in the reception hall of the Abbasid Caliphal palace at Samarra, dating to around the mid-9th century. The original fresco is very fragmentary, so I'm showing you Hertzfeld's reconstruction, which he produced in 1913. Many scholars have argued that the iconography of the dancing girls in these contexts are adaptations of Sasanian and Greco-Roman Mediterranean visual cultures inherited by the early Muslim dynasties. Images of dancers frequently appear in the arts of the Fatimid period as well, such as on this luster-painted bowl from the Freer Gallery of Art in Washington. Although the female dancer depicted on this bowl and on other medieval Egyptian objects are often compared to the Samara dancers, the type of dance portrayed here is altogether very different. Let's take a closer look at the image on this bowl. The female performer is central in this composition and is rendered in a lively dance posture as she kneels on her right leg while her left knee bends at a right angle. Her left arm curves downward and her hand rests on her knee. In a counterpoised position, her right arm curves upward and touches her head, which inclines slightly to her right. Most scholars have assumed that the dancer grips a scarf in each hand and hence performs a kind of scarf dance. However, the long articles of fabric that she grips are extremely long sleeves attached to her fitted blouse, not scarves. The artist's detailed rendering of the circular openings at the end of each sleeve affirms this attribution. I'm talking about these circular openings here and here. Thus, the extension of each tube-like sleeve is wrapped into her fists and left to hang down. The Freer Gallery bowl is one of several reconstructed luster-painted bowls featuring sleeve dancers. A second bowl shown here on the left belongs to the Museum of Islamic Art in Cairo, and two fragmentary bowls on the right are housed at the Museum of Islamic Art in Berlin. They follow similar iconographic models, although two of the bowls feature the dancers standing upright on one leg with counterpoised arms and with the addition of a long wavy scarf worn across the dancer's chest and a halo around her head. Oh, this is just a better picture of one of the Berlin bowls because it was hard to show there, but you can just see her sleeve, her long sleeve there, and kind of here, the long wavy scarf across her chest and the halo. And I just wanted to show you that this is what luster should really look like. It shimmers. Okay. The iconography of the sleeve dancer appears on all manner of material culture from Fatimid Egypt, from the deeply carved ivory and wood panels shown on the center and right that likely adorned the interior spaces such as doors or furniture, to painted wall frescoes, such as the image on the top left, discovered in the debris of an excavation of a hammam or bathhouse built on a hill in Fustat. The painted niches include pearl-bordered frames with confronting hares, adorsed birds, and the well-known seated youth holding a cup down here. To my mind, the depiction on the niche shown above is a sleeve dancer. Okay, so we can see there's a person there with sort of knee bent. I feel like this is her sleeve, and you can just about see the other sleeve there. The combination of seated drinker and sleeve dancer also appears together on the Louvre ivory panel over here and in other places. And the style of depiction of the hammam figures share an affinity with images on luster ceramics. The sleeve dancer also appears in a definitively royal or courtly context carved on the wooden panels that once decorated the walls and ceilings of the Western Fatimid Palace in Cairo, the smaller of the two royal palaces built by the Imam Caliph Al-Aziz and assigned to his daughter Sitt al-Mulk, sister of Imam al-Hakim. Sorry, the map is a little small. There's Bain al-Qasrain, and there's the Western Fatimid Palace, the smaller one that Sitt al-Mulk lived in, across from the giant Eastern Palace. Okay, here, images of dancers on these carved wooden panels are arranged alongside musicians, hunters, seated princes, birds, and beasts. In this context, the sleeve dancers appear to be male figures wearing turbans, whereas the dancer with castanets is likely female based on her headdress. So we have a dancer here that's not a sleeve dancer, she has castanets in her hand, and she wears a different headdress, one of these fluttering headband headdresses. Whereas the sleeve dancer here, kneeling, you can see the sleeves, is wearing a kind of turban. And this is a musician with their hands upright, playing a flute. These are wonderful images by Sabiha Khamir for her PhD thesis on these wooden panels. Oh, wait a minute. Where was I? One can conjecture that this dance was performed at the palace, and it is reported that Sitt al-Mulk had 4,000 slave girls working for her. So presumably some of them were accomplished dancers, musicians, and singers. Some of the most vivid depictions of sleeve dancers appear on the painted Muqarna ceiling of the Cappella Palatina in Palermo, Sicily. The wooden ceiling of the royal chapel was probably completed by the year 1143 and was made under the patronage of the Norman king Roger II, who reigned from 1130 to 1154. Scholars agree that the main artistic sources of the painted ceiling are to be found in Fatimid Egyptian craftsmanship. And there is substantial bibliography available on this topic, including the monumental work by the late Professor Ernst Gruber. There are over 3,000 framed paintings on the ceiling comprising courtly, mythological, and biblical iconography, including a number of dancers and musicians. So the picture on the top right, really, this is the chapel. It's a Byzantine mosaic decorated chapel through and through. And then you have this amazing wooden Muqarna ceiling. And I'm just showing you images of the dancers, some of the dancers. And if you had any doubts, take a look at this dancer. Her hands are completely covered in her sleeves. And meanwhile, her counterpart who's playing the castanets, you can very easily see her fingers. So clearly, the artists understood this iconography, and it is highly likely that sleeve dancing was also performed at the court of Roger II, who not only had Muslim artists create this wondrous ceiling for his royal chapel, but he also borrowed the administrative, military, and visual cultures of Fatimid Egypt. And Sicily was also a mixed population of Arabic and Greek speakers at the time. Right, so who are these sleeve dancers? Where did they come from? What do we know about the origins of this dance form, and why did it take Fatimid Egypt by storm in this way? Once again, we are indebted to the late Professor Ernst Gruber for pointing us in the direction of Central Asia and China. The Han dynasty, which ruled from 206 BC to 220 AD, already had several forms of sleeve dancing called Xiuwu, which were discerned by the lightness of the dancer's steps, the complex movements of the hands and the long sleeves, complex movement of the hands and the long sleeves, and the emotional expressions of the dancers. But it was quite a slow, graceful dance depicted here in the tomb figurine in the middle. However, it was during the era of the Northern and Southern dynasties, so the 5th and 6th centuries, and the period of the Tang dynasty from 616 to 906, that Central Asian music and dance traditions from the areas of Sogdiana, the area between the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya rivers in present-day southern Uzbekistan and western Tajikistan, which had a profound impact on Chinese music and dance. The so-called Silk Routes were one of the primary conduits by which foreign musicians came to China, and the Sogdians acted as the main middlemen in this trade. Large Sogdian trade communities lived in the Tang capital, Shangan, a cosmopolitan metropolis of its time. Courtiers, dancers, singers, musicians, and other entertainers were sent as tribute to the Tang emperor, while others came by their own free will to achieve fame and fortune in the cities of the Tang Empire. The figurines on the right and the left, can you notice they have the tighter sleeves of different outfit from the Han Dynasty dancer? That's because West Asian influence from Iran of wearing tight sleeves profoundly affected the fashions of the Tang dynasty. And so these are burial figurines that have been preserved. Okay. Poetry composed by Chinese writers to describe these include descriptions of the Sogdian dancers. And they also appear in artworks from the Tang period as dancers with pointed hats wearing garments with tight sleeves. The type of dance described is vigorous because it required fast whirling. And so in the literature, it's kind of called the Sogdian whirl. And so I have the poem here from Liu Yanxi. The Iranian from Tashkent appears young. He dances to the music, holding the wine goblet as rapid as a bird. He wears a cloth cap of foreign make, empty and pointed at the top. His Iranian robe of fine felt has tight sleeves. Clearly, they're conflating the Iranians and the Central Asians, but you get the point. You can see the amazing sleeves here. And these are also meant to be sleeves. Another poem describes the whirling, vigorous dance of the Huhuswan girls of Central Asia, maybe referring to the dancers from Samarkand. Huhuswan girls, Huhuswan girls. Your hearts respond to strings, your hands to drums. When strings and drums sound, your hands are raised. You turn, whirl, and dance like falling snow. Turn to the left, pivot to the right without knowing fatigue. Make 1,000 turns, 10,000 revolutions without stopping. Nothing in the world is comparable to you. The wheels of a moving cart, the eddying of the wind are even slower. Unfortunately, I have yet to locate an explicit reference to sleeve dancing in Fatimid historical literature or in the Cairo Geniza documents. There are references to singers and dancers who were kept as slave girls, and mentions of female entertainers were present at weddings, births, picnics, and even group visits to the hammam. The 11th century Book of Gifts and Rarities recounts the contents of an impressive caravan of gifts sent by the Fatimid Caliph Az-Zahir to his governor in North Africa, which included beautiful slave girls, extolled as expert singers and captivating dancers. Although we are not told what these beautiful entertainers were wearing or the type of dance they were performing, we are told that they rode in ornamented sedan chairs set on top of Bactrian camels from Khorasan. And I quote the verse here, as the slim-waisted dancers moved to the chants, their moves to the tune seemed themselves like song. Were their footsteps to fall on the eyes of a sore-eyed man, he would not complain that their sandals were even eyelids. The Fatimid period did not coincide with the Tang dynasty. They were contemporaries with the emperors of the Song dynasty, which ruled from 960 to 1279. The Song emperors, like their Tang predecessors and their contemporaries, the Fatimids, ruled major metropolitan cities of their time. The Song and Fatimid dynasties boosted the traffic of foreign goods, people, and their ideas and culture by becoming the principal players of international trade. Many scholars of Indian Ocean and Silk Road studies have emphasized that transport over long distances are drivers of social change and development. Intellectual progress in these regions was promoted through the establishment of places of learning and public and private libraries. The Geniza documents also paint a vivid picture of a middle-class bourgeoisie with a taste for the latest luxury wares and forms of entertainment. Both the Song and Fatimid dynasties were happy to portray themselves as powers with both Western and Eastern connections and aspirations. The Fatimid dynasty's inclination towards the East is attested from its establishment and control over a vast network of trade and commerce between the Mediterranean world and India, China, and other parts of Asia. And the 10th and 11th century saw a scramble for leadership between the three caliphal capitals, Cordoba, Cairo, and Baghdad. This race for power and legitimacy stimulated a dynamic tension which promoted long-distance networks. At times, religious considerations and designs motivated Fatimid commercial interests. The Fatimid Dawa or institution of the propagation of Ismailism was led by trained and learned da'is or religious emissaries, who often adopted the guise of merchants in order to travel safely through dangerous anti-Ismaili lands. Da'is established Ismaili communities in the Abbasid-governed lands of Khorasan and Transoxania. Finally, Cairo's political and economic stability attracted artisans and craftsmen from various parts of the Muslim world. In their day, luster pottery, carved wood, and ivory artifacts were almost certainly sought in the first place, precisely because they made their owners conspicuous and contributed to their self-representation or identity, elevating their status. These and other reasons explain the popularity of the sleeve dancer in the arts of the Fatimid period. Very quickly, I hope I'm not over time. We have examples of the spread and development of the sleeve dance in Eastern Islamic lands. I have on the left a picture of the Sufi dancers from the Timurid period in Herat. In the middle, I have a page from the Shahnameh, Bahram Gur entertained by the daughters of Barzin, which is from the Mongol period, 1300 to 1330. And on the right, I have an example of a dancer, a sleeve dancer here. And this was made in Kashan, Iran during the Seljuk period in the 12th century. So in conclusion then, yes, what I really wanted to do was show you what a Fatimid sleeve dance looked like, so that you could get a sense of the effect it might have had on the viewer. What made it so powerful and attractive? Unfortunately, I couldn't find you a Fatimid sleeve dance, but I have found you a 2004 interpretation of a Tang sleeve dance from the movie House of Flying Daggers. And I just want Nosheen to play it for you, because it's really hard to show video on Zoom. Apologies if the picture becomes a bit jerky. I just want you to get a sense of the magnificence of the sleeve dance, and that'll end my thank you. Thanks very much, Nosheen. So yeah, that's the end of my paper. Thank you very much.
Amida, what a way to conclude. Fantastic. Thank you so much for such a thoroughly engaging and visually rich presentation. Wonderful stuff. Okay, so we now come to our final speaker on our panel for this afternoon. And he is Professor Avinoam Shalom, who is currently the Reggio Professor for the Arts of Islam at Columbia University at New York. As with others on this panel, he needs no introduction from me, having contributed very extensively to the field of Islamic art history at both the theoretical and historical levels. His lecture today is entitled Back to Black, the Rediscovery of Black Ground, a global visual phenomenon at the age of the Fatimids. Avinoam, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon, and thank you all. I'm going to share my screen with you, and just bear with me. I think, do you see it? Is it okay, Simon?
Yes, that's absolutely fine. Very clear and also sound perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's quite difficult to start now after the great finale that Fahmida gave us, but bear with me, I'm taking you now into discussions about textiles. So we are still in the realm of clothes. I would like to thank, of course, the Ismaili Center for Islamic Studies in London for doing this great conference, and I'm very happy to be here. Very happy also to see a lot of my colleagues here in this panel today. In one of his famous and widely cited articles on some problems in the semiotic of visual arts, while reflecting on the concept of a contour, the art historian and critic Meir Shapiro wrote, and I cite, "The thick black outline is an artificial equivalent of the apparent form of a face and has the same relation to the face that the color and thickness of the outline of the land mass in map has to the character of the coast. It would still denote the same face for us if the image sign were outlined in white on black ground, just as a written word is the same in different colored inks. Indeed, for Meir Shapiro, who was much focused on meaning in art, the change of color from black to white of the very contour that outlined the shape of a face or that of a sinuous shoreline does not make any difference. And yet, one cannot resist challenging the saying of Meir Shapiro, because despite the no change in content, the switch from black line on white background to white line on black background transmit totally different feel, as it is a change from day to night. Now, look even at the PowerPoint presentation when I'm showing now the back to black on white on black, what it looked like if I would change it now the other way around. Whereas content remains the same, the aesthetic content is totally different. Moreover, modification in aesthetic can certainly cause shift in expression and in turn in meaning. Shapiro was not fully right. Words written in other color, and especially signs, might be read and understood differently when using different colors on background. I would like to revise Shapiro's last sentence and to claim that any image, sign, or word would certainly not denote the same if a change in outline happens, and especially if the image sign were outlined in white on black ground.
Avinoam, I'm
Yes.
sorry to interrupt. I'm not sure that the slides are moving quite as you thought.
I know. They will move in a minute.
Okay, fine.
Thank you. Darkening backgrounds and making figures, object, and inscription on any abstract shape visible by highlighting them and by using light and white colors for the contours, and though the whole scene or spaces of the depicted images with an extra dramaturgic effect, intensify the depicted scene and even arouse the beholder's excitement. Caravaggio was much aware of the great effect that the dark spaces in his painting produce. His images appear as if gleaming and glittering out of the obscure and dark areas into which they were set. The discovery of the great possibility of black background as an expressive tool and the artist's cognition of the dramaturgy that this effect brings to any visual composition can go back to ancient time, to the red color figures on black and on black background, which appears on Greek terracotta vessels from around 500 before the Common Era, or to the black figures painting on Greek terracotta, whose bodies' contours were drawn with white pigments. Along the many centuries, the will to art, the Kunstwollen, craftsmen and artists were cognizant of this aesthetic sensation. Moreover, as I will argue, in specific moment of technological innovation and the discoveries of novel dark substances, specific preference for black background was favored by artists for making art. And yet, in the 10th century, and especially around 1000, Arabic inscription, either in white and bright colors, started to appear on black or dark background. The strong visual effect achieved by contrasting dark and light color is evident. The Arabic inscription became more visible and powerful and enhanced the dramatic quality of the depicted image of the world. What were the forerunner for the emergence of this specific visual phenomenon? Can one suggest a global aesthetic notion for this artistic urge? Can one speak about the medieval melanomania, a craze for the black? One of the early texts to emphasize the aesthetic value of the color black, Al-Aswad, can be found in the writing of one of the prolific writers of the early Abbasid period, and I'm talking about Al-Jahiz. Born in Basra and died in the same city in 1868, Al-Jahiz established his scholarly reputation in Baghdad and Samarra. His ancestors were the Banu Kinana, a clan of Black African origin, namely of Abyssinians. It is therefore no wonder that Al-Jahiz devoted a whole book about the glory of the Black race and discussed the merits of the dark colors. And he says, when the Arabs described the camels, they said the black horse are most beautiful and most robust, the black cows best and most beautiful, and their skins are more valuable, most useful, and most durable. El-Jais kept exalting merits of dark color in other animals and objects, and he ends his passage by saying, black ebony is the most solid and most durable of woods. It is also most expensive, free of disease, and fits for artwork. He also praises the black as the preferable color in paradise. And I don't get now into the whole description of the specific coal that they will have on their eyes, but he adds that the color black caused him to ponder on the merits of shade and the dark night. He ends by saying, no color is deeper and homogeneous than black. The aesthetic of contrast between dark and light colors appears in several Abbasid accounts, and especially in poems and poetical description. Jacob Lassner provides us in his book on the topography of Baghdad with several interesting poetic descriptions gathered by Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi. These poetic verses compared the famous bridge of the city to the artifacts decorated with black and white decor. So I cite, it was as though the Tigris was white robe, and the bridge which spanned it was the black embroidered border. Or in another account, we hear that the bridge was like, and I cite, a line of black perfume drawn on a white parting of the hair, or like ivory, which is ornamented with ebony, cut in the shape of elephants, beneath which there is a ground of mercury. Interesting. It is quite interesting that the both cited Abbasid poetic symbols refer to artworks, to black band of a tiraz on a white garment or a black ground set within carved ivory panels. Moreover, the metaphor of textile and threads appear also in the Quran, in Surah Al-Baqarah. In verse 187, it is said that on the night of the fast, the distinction between night and day can be detected as soon as the dawn appears as a white thread, which is clearly distinguished from the black threads of night. حتى يتباين لكم الحيط الأبيض من الحيط الأسود. It is likely that with the adoption of the color black by the Abbasid, Arabic inscription that had usually been woven on black threads on white and light background were ought to be woven with white and shiny thread on black and dark woven surfaces in order to be clearly seen and to be read. The case of the Abbasid black banner is most illustrative. Is most illustrative phenomena, and indeed several black banners of the early Abbasid period were called the shadow or the clouds. A small group of mainly monochrome luster-painted ceramic dishes, which are usually attributed to Iraq and are dated to the 10th and the 10th century, provide us with some clearly illustration of banners and flag bearers. Among this specific group is a plate decorated with a standard bearer holding aloft a banner with Arabic inscription. It is decorated with a quite grotesque figure holding in both hands a large triangular banner. The banner is dark and is decorated with three motifs: a small medallion at the lower edge, a large one with a band of what it seems to be Kufic inscription at the center, and I don't have time to read it, and a further Kufic inscription written in white, which fills the dark background of the fly edge. Other illustration, mainly those taken from the Maqamat of Al-Hariri, in which banners are depicted, as well as other glazed ceramics assigned to Khorasan and datable between 900 and 1000, attest to the frequent appearance of Arabic inscription in white on black background. It is likely that the black color that dominate the royal manufacture of Abbasid textile, and hence the aesthetic contrast between dark and bright colors. And it is possible that the Tiraz bands adopted this preference too. Thus, this preference might explain the frequent appearance of Kufic floriated inscription on black and dark background at the royal weaving center of the ruling courts in the 9th and the 10th century. See, for example, the fragment that I'm showing you of a woolen and linen Abbasid Tiraz band, such were woven in the 9th or the 10th century in Fayum in Egypt, or the two fragments of wool and linen plain weave, delicate textile, most probably shawls from the Coptic Abbasid Cairo, which both were kept in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. This is the one, and this is the other one. The appearance of glittering and shining inscription on black background most probably contribute to the ta'ajub, the act of being aesthetically overwhelmed. During the Fatimid era, mainly in the 10th century and the 11th century, and the white and black aesthetic of Arabic inscription appears on textiles, metalwork, and carved ivories too. The rectangular ivory caskets in Madrid is highly important for our discussion. This casket, which is kept at present at the Archaeological Museum in Madrid, as well as its sister one, kept in Mantua in Italy, present a shift in decorating ivories in mid-10th century in the Mediterranean. The casket clearly displayed their smooth and undecorated panels, which are framed by narrow bands of carved and painted panels. The decor composition went through a radical shift. Instead of having the ornament filled at the center of each panel, the ornamental areas are restricted to the narrow borders, thus accentuating the brightness and of the substance of ivory and displaying the smooth ivory panel as the main decor of this casket. Yes, one can suggest that the narrow carved and painted panels of this casket frame ivory, or even perhaps frame brightness and light. The Kufic inscription that encircles the lid of the casket from Madrid keeps the idea of framing light. Moreover, the fact that the carved inscription appears on a dark painted background accentuates the aesthetic concept of this casket of whiteness contrasted by blackness, and symbolically speaking of radiance upon darkness. The inscription records that the casket was made for the Fatimid Caliph al-Mu'izz, 953 to 975 reigning, and was made in Al-Mansuriya near Cairo. By the second half of the 10th century, as the production of carved ivory saw a boom in the royal and caliphal court in Spain, the practice of having black substance at the background of carved Arabic inscription on ivory was spread. The craftsmen were most probably cognizant of the strong effect of the black and white contrast in decorating ivories. Remnants of black substance, probably a mastic vegetal one, has been discovered on several carved ivories containers from Al-Andalus. See, for example, the scale box that I've shown you in Klostenburg and Orense. A close look at the carved inscription on these boxes, which consists of the repetition of the word baraka in a floriated Kufic, suggests that the carvers created a high relief carving in which the areas of the background of the Arabic word were deeply carved and later filled with a possibly black mastic substance. Rest of black substance appear on the background of the cylindrical casket from Victoria and Albert Museum, as well as on the one a bit later from Turin. A craze for darkening backgrounds of carved and chiseled Arabic inscription appear in Western Asia too, around the 11th century. This was done by the using of bitumen, also known as asphaltos in ancient time, and as mumia in Arabic. In modern Arabic, it's kar, referring to the black color. Now, the bitumen is a semi-solid form of actually petroleum. This praxis flourishes later during the 12th and the 13th century, especially in the region of Iran. And I show you the 12th century incense burner for the Freer Gallery here. And you can see that at the background of the medallions, they are engraved with a vegetal ornament, looks a bit like an Arabic inscription, and were inlaid with black organic material, the bitumen. But the craze for blackening the background of Arabic inscription can also be detected on yellowed object. Yellow, a specific technique for darkening silver and gold and for creating shiny black and dark gray surfaces on vessels of this precious metal was used around the same time. Interesting to note that one of the major objects, and I'm taking us back to the object that Anna Contadini showed us today and excellently presented, I'm looking at this Fatimid, this object made under a Fatimid patronage in the 11th century from the treasury of San Isidoro de Leon in Spain, which was made for the Fatimid vizier, as we heard, Ṣadaqa ibn Yūsuf. At any case, Fatimid textile bearing Arabic inscription mentioning names of Fatimid caliphs were frequently woven in light colors on dark woven textile or on dark woven bands. It is likely that this surviving fragment of Tiraz textile were part of the caliph's propaganda and could be used as pious donation, robes, turban, and shawls of honor, all of which propagates and spread the caliph's name in public sphere. And I show you, for example, the one from the Metropolitan Museum, but several other Fatimid example of fragment of dark blue, silk and linen woven turbans with tiraz bands of Arabic letter woven in off-white threads accentuate the aesthetic penchant for darkness and the appearance of the inscription as if made of light. This type of extremely thin textile was most probably made in Tunis, one of the main centers for weaving with linen and silk during the Fatimid period. The Arabic inscription on the turban from the Benaki Museum in Athens mentioned the name of the Imam al-Aziz Billah, and therefore suggests that these dark blue delicate textile were produced during the Al-Aziz reign between 975 to 996. Yet, to judge from the surviving Fatimid fragments of textile in Egypt, like the one that I show you here from the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, it is likely that in the 11th century, Kufic Arabic inscription woven in light threads reappear on narrow bands of dark colors. And I'm just calling your attention to this rest of this dark color as the background that we still see here. Moreover, the fact that these dark bands appear on textile of light color suggests that the appearance of Arabic script in light color on black background was a desired image. Several examples dated to the time of the Fatimid Caliph al-Zahir between 1020-1035 and the time of al-Bustansir 1036 to 1094 illustrate this notion. It is tempting to associate this aesthetic notion with the rise of the technology of block printing around the same time, namely around the year 1000, and especially the use of metal blocks for block printing on which the areas of the printed letters stand above the main surface, while the background consists of a sunken area that hold within the ink. And I show you some example of this Fatimid block printing where you can see how you get this image of dark bands and then the inscription itself appears with no color. Let me conclude. The stars of wise saying shine in the darkness of the ink, said once the Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun. And indeed, the Kufic Arabic inscriptions on either dark-colored textile or dark bands appear as if light emanates from the Arab script, as if the Arab words shine out of the darkness of the black background. It is beyond the scope of this short lecture to delve into the Fatimid concept of Zahir and Batin that were mentioned already in this conference and on which Jennifer Pruitt actually discussed quite a lot in her recent book. Yet, as I try to emphasize here, artistic, aesthetic, and technologies of art making seem to work in tandem. The production of knowledge of art making, namely techne, appears as an aesthetic notion, a will to art, and therefore should not be separated from making of meaning, the way that light was separated from darkness and day parted from night. Thank you.